side of things and how what you can do to make runs interesting. We'll go to the next slide. Okay. Did you want to cover this, Spio? Or should we handle this?
You can handle it.
Yeah, okay. Because what is the Matrix? The simple answer is, don't think about it too hard, especially if you're actually in IT. It'll bog your brain. Magnets. The complex answer is that it is 100 technometer brains melted down. You can find out more information about that in, is it Kill Code covers that, right? Or is
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. The best, like the simple but complex answer is it's close enough to the internet, although if you work in actual IT or system design, it'll boggle your brain. It's way closer to Bluetooth floating around and doing everything, but it's all done in full body, subversive, SimSense VR. And one of the important details is that people rarely ever turn the wireless off. All right, next slide. Describing the Matrix. This is a personal pet peeve of mine, and it's a thing that I'm going to hammer into the end of time. If there's a problem that you have to deal with when you're running a game, that everyone goes off for 15 minutes and gets pizza when the decker has to do their host dive. The way to avoid that is to make the Matrix cool to watch, right? Describe everything. Treat it as if you were running any character through a dungeon. That as you jump into a new room or a new location, make sure you take a second to remind everyone what they're looking at, right? Avoid just having the decker as a formless shape floating through an empty black void of networks. Remember that every host is going to have sculpting, every grid's going to have sculpting, and everyone's going to have their own personal persona. And remind deckers where they are in relation to all these things, and give them information. You can give them information via rules, but you can also give them information based on what they're seeing in the sculpting. The next one is, it's very easy to break down Matrix and host dives into dice wars. And while dice wars can be a kind of exciting, you can have that while making sure that your targets look like NPCs and they look like actual users of the Matrix. You can make them scary or understated. You can do everything that you could do with a meat space operator on the Matrix, but you also have other angles you can play with that SimSense can do that reality cannot, and have fun with it, right? There's no reason why you couldn't have. I won't go into too many explanations because I could be here all day, but you can have those things. You've got a little section here, Rabbit, about your wage slaves and your security, or...
Yeah. So here's the thing. So everybody uses the Matrix, and most of these people are just wage slaves. They don't actually know how the Matrix works. They just use it because it's all designed to be very user friendly like that. Wage slaves are going to be too lazy to report 90. That's probably a conservative estimate of the issues that they experience on the Matrix. If you hack a wage slave so that his comlink routes somewhere else, or you steal a file off it, and maybe you even fail a sleaze action there, and it alerts the owner, they are going to play that off in that weird mark that they get for no reason. They're going to play that off as a glitch. They're not going to bother reporting it, because who wants to talk to IT when you got a bunch of shit to do on your 96-hour shift. The next level down from there is security, physical security personnel. They know basics. They do know that a failed sleaze action is not something to be taken lightly, and they will generally report those sorts of things. And finally, you have Matrix specialists, which know exactly what's going on. They know all of the tricks, and they know what to look for. And they are going to be the most vigilant ones that you do not want to alert. And we will.
Is it fair to say, in your mind, that a Matrix specialist will be as competent, if not more, than a enemy decker? Well, enemy decker, us.
Oh, well, absolutely. Depends on the decker and the threat level and whatnot. But Matrix specialists definitely know what throws red flags and what to do to try to counter people.
But don't forget, they're still people. So if their end of things gets on the line, they're going to get in trouble for reporting you. They're going to fall behind schedule. All of those things can make them less than optimum too. So don't be afraid to have your Matrix specialist.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely. All right, are we going on to the next one? Okay.
So,
Go for it.
so yes, the Matrix for non-hackers. Everybody, like I covered, everybody uses the Matrix. It's insanely easy to use the Matrix. There is not a lot of things that aren't on the Matrix. Things that have even things that really have no business being wirelessly enabled are generally wirelessly enabled. You know, a rock out on the road is just about the only thing that's not going to be on the Matrix, and even then, that may just have an RFID tag to track the traffic patterns. So the Matrix pervades all of society. You use it to control just about everything. You don't have a key for your car anymore because you start it through your comm link. You know, you figure out where you get up in the morning. You order your coffee online. You tell your car to drive you to work. You use the Matrix to open up the door. You use the Matrix to turn on your workstation in the morning. All of, everything is done through this massive wireless system, and that is why hackers are very powerful, because they're designed to exploit that. And that's just exactly why the wireless Matrix is terrifying, because as we covered at the beginning, imagine if everything ran on Bluetooth and your Bluetooth was on open all day. Everything in your hand, everything on your workstation, your entire life can be altered, manipulated, and destroyed by people that know how to manipulate the Matrix. At the same time, this is a very incredible thing because it just makes everything more convenient. You don't have to walk to where you parked your car. You don't even have to remember where you parked your car. You just call it to come pick you up at the curb.
And the powers that be will insist that the Matrix is 100% safe for normal people.
Yes. Because they stand to profit incredibly off of it, because they can use all of these little habits to use the Matrix to every little thing to track your data and sell that data to other people, or just use it for marketing schemes and such. So it's an interesting double-edged sword like that. The other big people that use the Matrix, first and foremost, are riggers. Riggers use the Matrix as a vehicle to do what they do. They use the Matrix to connect into things, jump into their vehicles, to command their drones, everything. And really, anybody with a comic is using the Matrix, just in very different and more mundane sorts of ways. We'll move on here. And I believe this is your bit, Anthony.
Absolutely. There's been these little, I love these little in-betweens, but the Matrix is absolutely everywhere and almost in everything. Your wage slave, as you said, gets out up in the morning and his coffee's made, his stays scheduled ahead of time, and his car is already being warmed up. We have access to, as deckers, have access to everything, and as a GM, you should be willing to remind the decker of such. Mention security systems, mention camera systems, mention the lights which will be on, the fire system that'll be on. There is they are all masters of environmental control, and benefit the rest of the team. Yes, benefit the rest of the team. You can affect, again, the entire battlefield. If you go into a building, every single section in the building will probably have a wireless on component and can be manipulated as such. And for the firefight.
And don't be afraid to encourage nonlinear thinking. As a GM, you control all of the opposition. If you let them brainstorm and you encourage them to think out of the box, things like you're in a high-speed chase, usually it's just the rigger involved, but the decker can mess with the traffic patterns. He can tell GridLink the intersection is clear and start car crashes. He can tell the lights to turn green. All of that stuff is possible if you get them thinking about You know, can you have a fire hydrant go off and spray water? Can you have the smoke alarms go off? Can you throw fire suppressant in the air? They'll be looking for ways to be involved too, and not have to do a host dive.
Remember, subvert infrastructure is your friend for a lot of these things, right? Subvert infrastructure can be a catch-all for pretty much those affecting an entire system all at once. It's great.
Simple systems, but yes.
And
Yeah.
we'll talk about that in a little.
Absolutely. You've got hackers in a firefight here, Ravid. I'm sure you've got a few spots to talk about.
Yeah. So big thing with hackers. So it very much used to be, especially before we got a lot of updated stuff from Killcode, that hackers had their moment in the sun when they were doing host dives, when they were stealing data from comlinks. During infiltrations, to a limited degree, if your GM and your hacker were creative enough to find uses in that. Hackers in a firefight now, we have a lot of new actions, and we're going to go over the specific actions a little later, but you have ways to debuff the enemy in the firefight, you have ways to buff your own team, which I'm sure a lot of you are already aware of. And really, the hacker no longer has to sit out while the SAMs do their job. The hacker can fight right alongside them while hiding in the van and just messing with things on the battlefield.
Absolutely. Okay.
Now, we're going to very, very briefly talk about the Deep Matrix because it is big enough to warrant its own workshop, which is going to happen eventually. Essentially, you have foundations and why we go there. You can do things like alter the sculpting, even destroy the hosts from the foundations. And Resonance Realms are a point deeper. They're very similar to a metaplane in that case, but dealing with resonance instead of magic. And we have page references here, Data Trails 106 for Foundations, Data Trails 128 for Resonance Realms. We encourage you, if you're interested in these, to go look into there and read those chapters, and obviously ask us questions at a later time. But as I said, we're not going to get too deep into this now. So tread lightly, and we will follow up in the future.
In the handouts as well, I've given up a more detailed breakdown of the different sections. If you're interested, I would suggest to everyone, learn the Matrix first. Don't go any further until you've learned the Matrix and you're completely secure with that knowledge. And one thing I would suggest is to skim those sections really lightly, just so you have an idea of what's capable. And then once you're completely comfortable with the Matrix, you can look into it.
But don't rush. The deeper levels get complicated and don't work the same. Don't be afraid to leave them for later.
Absolutely. Okay, should we go to the next slide?
We are on the next slide, Anthony.
Deeper dives. Oh, deeper dives. Did you want to cover this one, Spio, or?
I can talk about it. So this is just a light overview, and we'll come back to this. These are things that are in the Matrix that aren't people. So, normal people expect to see people in the Matrix. They expect to see programs that they're running, files that they're working with. There are also these other things, and there's plenty of strange, and it doesn't even stop here, but the highlight is that you have AI, artificial intelligences, that are just like people, only they don't have bodies. They've never had bodies. There are three main kinds of them. We'll get into that later. You have techno-critters, which are like para-animals, except that they have resonance and can directly interact with the Matrix despite being animals. Because they're animals, they might be in there hunting prey. They might be eating icons that you need. They might be distracting people or summoning guards to your location by haunting you because they're curious. You never know. There are actual weirder things. We put them under the heading of beasts of nowhere. Things like the digital werewolves. And unfortunately, I set my notes somewhere funny. Spy, do you have the... No, we'll keep going. So people are used to working with hosts, but there are wild hosts, which are a category that have iconography that includes vines and jungle things that are crawling through the iconography with strange lights, and they make really good mood settings for ghost stories or things hiding and telling stories that have unknown things sneaking up on people. And often in those haunted houses of hosts are the Null Sect, which are alien intelligences that no one can explain and very few people know about, that would really like the Matrix to be allowed to run the way it's supposed to be without any of these pesky people or anything made by their hands. So they want the Matrix to be clean and sanitized, and they really, really hate AI and technomancers.
A slight correction with AI. People who didn't have people is correct for all but one kind of AI. E-ghosts are technically AI, but they are at least believed to be former people who died during the second crash.
Certainly they think they're people. They'll tell you that.
The sane ones.
They also fit in with ghost stories quite well.
Some are just fragments of the original personality, while others are more coherent.
Indeed.
Okay. Here's my little bit to go overboard. So we're gonna do this the same way we did, where I'm gonna run through our first little dive, and I'll toss it back to the rules team, and you guys can clarify exactly what's happening on the rules side. Because we're gonna go through our first host dive today. And for you GMs out there, and players, in fact, if you haven't ever run a host dive on the player's end or on the GM end, I would definitely suggest paying attention to this next section, because if you'll see this same run happen a million times over the course of your career as a Shadowrunner. Now, we're going to start off with our boy Johnny Shadowrunner, who is a Nova Hot Decker, or at least he seems to think he is. And he's gotten information from his fixer saying that his fixer's put up some work for him. He just needs to and Johnny can only see $signs when he sees this, because all he's got to do is break onto a tiny little host and make a few edits. So he's just seeing $signs is all he's doing, and he's Nova Hot, so he knows that he can handle it. He accepts the job, and we're going to go for a little float. He's going to lay back and jump over into VR. Do we want to talk about VR really quickly, or talk about that one later?
We're going to go over the mechanics of the access modes and other things later.
Mm-hmm.
The important thing here, I thought that slide came first, but the important thing here is that Johnny is going to be going at this in VR, out of body, as opposed to doing augmented reality hacking, which is also possible, but not going to be happening for him right now.
Okay. Right. So we're going to have Johnny pop over onto VR, and the first thing that's going to happen is he's going to jump onto the grid. Now, to double check with you, Frazier, my understanding is that as of kill code, we don't really mess around too much with the grid, right?
That's correct. Grids are they're still around, but the only one that actually matters anymore, thanks to backdoors that have been loaded, is the public free grid is deliberately slowed down by the corporations to make existence miserable, so you'll spend some money into their.
Well, technically all noise is a conspiracy by God, but yes, the public grid especially is, which is why acting onto or out of it always has that -2 you can never cancel out.
Okay. All right. So we're going to ignore the grid majorly for this part, because you'll ignore it on a lot of runs as well. But we're going to jump over mainly to Emerald City. Now, the first thing I would suggest doing is, once you jump onto a grid, to get people sort of settled into the whole out-of-body experience of VR, is describe Emerald City. You will probably be on Emerald City for most of the time you're there, so make sure you describe the Emerald City. Make sure you have your Decker describe their persona and all the different parts of their persona, and their agent if they're running one. Make sure they set themselves into the world before we go any deeper. But Johnny knows what host he's after. So we are going to float on over there, jump over to the appropriate global grid, and we are going to come to the outside of the first host. Where we're going to ask Johnny to do a major perception test, but once again, before we go any further, make sure you describe the outside of the host. It's covered in ads. It's represents a building in real life only twice the size. It's covered with the flashing logo of the company who owns this host. It's surrounded by salarymen who are jumping in and out from different parts of the world. Make sure that they're like situated and set into the scene before they actually start to interact with the scene, as if they were walking into a dungeon. But do we want to talk about major perception at this point?
Yes. So, Kill Code 33 has much more clear descriptions of matrix perceptions modes than the core book. They basically straighten it out into 3 real modes. You're going to spot an icon, you're analyze an icon, and you're going to you can also use it for the things that normal perception is, where you're just looking around. So a GM might ask for matrix perception to see if you notice abnormal traffic patterns or personas watching you or things like that. Just like in the real world, if people are following you and they're not exceptionally hidden, you might get a chance to notice them. If people are running silent, and we'll talk about modes when we go into detailed stuff, but if people are running silent, they're limiting their traffic to the matrix, and they're much harder to spot. If you're in a host with them, or if they're within 100 meters of you, you can spot them. Once you've spotted an icon, either because you see it or because you've done the spot check, you can analyze it, play 20 questions, and fish information out of it. There are a lot of standard questions for your 20 questions for things you'll most like to know, but feel free to encourage players to ask whatever they want to know. If it's information you think is reasonable that it would be encoded in a persona on the hardware or attached to the icon that they're looking at, give it to them, because you want to keep them engaged and have them be interested in this. So we're going to go back to Johnny and see what he sees here. Matrix perception, again, is computer plus intuition normally, and it is very much like perception in most of the modes.
Absolutely. And in this particular instance, Johnny is after one piece of information. Well, a couple of pieces of information, but it can all be done with one major perception check because he's Nova Hot. He wants to know the host rating and the array of the host. Do you want to have a quick word about that one, Frather? Or
so, well, all matrix entities and structures, all icons, that are devices and personas, are going to have an array, an attribute array. It's ASDF, attack, sleaze, firewall, data processing, not in that order. The ratings of hosts are going to be based on their type. We will talk about host types in a little bit. The important thing to know is that they go equal to the rating up to +3 to cover all 4 stats for a standard data host.
Absolutely. And one of the things I was mentioning is that you can find out what kind of host it is from the outside with a perception check, right?
Absolutely. You will also know a destination host when you walk up on it and it's like, come on in, it's great here.
Okay. So Johnny, being as Nova Hard as he is, he gets all of the information he needs. He finds out the rating of the host, and he notices that the array is loaded out to be the pretty standard. Sleaze is the lowest, attack is the second lowest, data processing is the third highest, and firewall is the highest. He's pretty used to seeing this array. Sometimes the data processing is higher than the firewall, but he knows what he's getting into. He's done the same run 1,000,000 times. Now, I want to make a quick little caveat here. I mentioned before Emerald City and didn't explain what Emerald City was for those who aren't aware. Emerald City is the Seattle local grid?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure I wasn't getting my terminology mixed up. Yes, it's the Seattle local grid, and it's all dressed up in bright green, and it used to be headed by the huge cooperation Nova NeoNet, but not anymore. Anyway, we've got Johnny on the outside. He knows. Yeah, we've got Johnny on the outside of the host. He's got all the information he needs to go give it a crack, and we're going to give it a crack to try and get onto this host. So he's going to prep up his deck and set all of his programs up and his array up so that his sleaze is maximized as much as possible. And he's going to hurl a hack on the fly towards the host. And whoop, no good. Sorry, Johnny. He bounces off the outside, which means that when he throws his matrix bolt at this thing, he fails and he gets marked. Do we want to talk about failed sleaze actions, failed attack actions at this point?
So all of the book covers this. Anything that's, if you look at the handouts on your matrix sheet, anything that's green is based on sleaze. Anything that's got a sleaze limit. If you fail, the thing you're going after gets a mark on you. Anything that's an attack action, which is red on the default matrix, anything limited by attack is an attack action. If you fail, you're going to take unsoakable damage, matrix damage, based on how much you missed by, as your code gets thrown back in your face.
Mm-hmm. The other difference is that if you fail a sleaze action, they get a mark on you and can see you. And if you fail a attack action,
all that happens is you get hurt. They don't know they're being
that's right.
attacked.
Yes, I almost made the mistake, which I've said before, but that's fine. A lot of this stuff will be on the handout. Like a lot of the specific links will be on the handout to different sections of the book. Read along with that if you'd like to. But Johnny, having failed his first attempt to try and get onto this host, but knowing what he knows about the Matrix, knows that a lot of the time, people bouncing off the outside of the host is the host working as intended. So normally it doesn't set off too many alarms if someone bounces off the outside. There are, of course, caveats to this, but he thinks to himself that he's got time. So he is going to jump back to his body. He's going to jump down from VR to AR, and then he is going to turn off his deck, reset his deck, and come back in with a fresh Overwatch score and without the mark on him. And he's going to fly back over to the host, and he's going to try this again. And this time, like, now with a little bit of humility to himself, and not thinking he is as Nova hot as he actually should think he is, he throws his bolt and he manages to actually get his mark. And with a little wipe of sweat off his brow, he decides to enter the host. And once again, when we enter into the host, before we do anything, before Johnny's player starts rolling dice, or before Johnny starts mixing around with his deck, as the GM, describe the inside of the host. It is a representation, in this case, it's a representation of the building that the host is attached to, only everything is magnified to 10 times the size and way more importance. And the interior is way nicer on the inside of this host than it is in real life. Everyone is in the same Matrix uniform as each other. They're all emblazoned with the icon. And there's an important detail that you should mention, which is the nice, friendly security guard floating around the outside of the host. And he is just doing his little patrols. And right on his chest is a nice little badge saying Patrol IC. So Johnny is aware of these facts, right? He's aware of where we are. Do we want to talk a little bit about IC now, Prather? Or
I wasn't going to until we actually get a little further into it, but we can't. I want to make sure we're going to break for questions in a little bit. I want to get through as much of this as we can before we get to that.
Okay, all right. So Johnny's jumped on in. Actually, do we want to break for questions right now before we go any further into this host type MPS?
Do we have any?
Yeah, I suppose we can ask for questions now. We're about right at the 30-minute mark.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and take questions in chat. Does anyone do the turn starts when you jump in? Turn order.
Oh, now here's my take on that one, and I've seen some different takes on that one. I like to use average. Personally, I like to just let the player go first and have all the IC and other people act after them. That's just the way I like to handle things. The other way I've seen it done is you take average initiative, right? So you take 3.5 for every dice that they have, and then their data processing on top, and you put them together, and then you work with that. And you can do that behind the scenes as well, or you can even just have them roll it, right? You can just have them roll it and then keep track that way.
So my recommendation is a little more straightforward. Avoid initiative like the plague for as long as you possibly can. So whatever abstraction method you want to for fairness, try hard unless they're doing something that's obvious and is going to put them into direct conflict immediately. Try hard not to do that. Give them like an action or two or three before you worry about what anybody else is doing. Figure out your patrol timers, which we'll talk about, and determine in your head how long they're going to have before they have to worry about the next pass on patrol. But try hard not to do initiative till you've got to, because it does slow things down and it's hard to keep people engaged when you get into mechanical turn taking.
Absolutely. It is one of the it's one of the few things in my mind. Like, can you roll up some initiative and we'll set up a thing? It's one of the very few one of the very simple things that actually immediately makes the rest of the table switch their brain off. Right? It's one of the things that disengages the rest of the table and just they sort of ignore it and just assume that it's the decker's job from now on in. I like to just go with the whole Decker acts first, and then anyone else who's doing their thing, I just note it after them.
It may be different if you have brute force hackers at your table where they're announcing by knocking too hard, but if they're being sneaky, at least until the first pass of patrol comes in, there's absolutely no need to take. So, Hidden, your question is how do you take care of cameras without taking too long, or Overwatch, or setting the host off? The easy answer for that is later in the presentation, but I'll tell you, it's subvert infrastructure. If what you really need to do is cameras, or controlling audio visual, or things like that, count them as a simple thing that can be subverted, because that's what it's for, and then you don't have to do the host dive part at all for the simple recon or making sure their team, doesn't show up on cameras.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, do we have any other questions there, Piers?
You can give it a minute to see if anyone has any more questions, and we'll start back. Second. Yes, it looks like somebody's typing. So we'll pause for questions.
Okay. Yep. And I think it's a good point
Okay.
now to note that, like,
Right.
if you have questions, just throw them on there, and we will all get to you eventually.
Yeah. Right. So.
Okay. What we're going to do with that, the relationships between, we've got sections later where we're going to talk about how these components work and get into some of the definitions and some of the interrelations. We'd like to have the demo done first, though, because that's obviously things that can bog it down pretty good.
All right.
We will, however, note down the questions to answer later.
Yeah. And what one matrix skill should a non-matrix specialist make good use of? Computer.
Computers.
And electronic warfare to a certain degree too, but computer absolutely.
Why?
So computer is good for several things, mainly so that you can do simple searches to help yourself out, or be able to do things like that without actually having a decker on your team, or a hacker
Absolutely.
of some sort.
And when you have a decker, you can assist them as well, which is also useful.
Yeah, teamwork is part of it, but the number one thing, in my opinion, is that computer can also be used for I am the firewall. So if you have anybody who's not a hacker, who happens to have a comm link with a reasonable data processing, they can pinch hit to attempt to raise defenses for the team. So if your mage is not doing any magic, or they're a buff mage or an alchemist or something, with computer skill, they could actually assist your firefight anyway.
I think we have some questions over in the workshop chat as well.
Yeah, so I have a question from Star. So generally where things are in the host doesn't matter since everything can be found with a matrix search test. Is there any way to make exploring the host sculpture more interesting / complex than just a simple test?
Oh, like from the GM side, I'll toss over to you, Frathia, for the more interesting mechanic side. But yeah, make the search interesting. Make sure that they are actually floating through the host, and tell them that the server section is down on the basement floor, and then actually make them float down to the basement and wander through. Have them actually rifle through files. Have their persona actually rifle through files, and more importantly, have them. You can feel the eyes of the patrol eyes and the like spiders on the back of your head the entire time, even though you know you're invisible as far as you can tell. Remind them that they're there and they can feel like they're being watched and they feel like they're being stalked, even if nothing has spotted them yet. Remind them that the host is alive and actually reacting to things happening on it. But sorry, Prather, I cut you off.
No, it's okay. So the important thing to remember is that from a narrative perspective, the sculpting is key. So even though mechanically a host is a great big box and everything can see everything, don't overemphasize that. Like Anthony's talking about, if your host is sculpted to be the headquarters building, all right, roll with it. You can matrix perceive things through the walls, through the floor, through the other stuff. The ice can see you and all that, technically. But if you emphasize the sensory parts, you can give them the feel that it's more than just a big box full of stuff. And you really want to avoid that. Now, mechanically speaking, it really is a big box full of stuff because Catalyst is Catalyst.
Mhm.
But the segregations you can do can be purely logical. For weirder host types, you can get into less logical, actual mechanical separations where you've kind of got rooms in your host, but don't worry about that too much when you're just describing stuff.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I love to do patrol eyes floating around. You were saying so, Rabbit?
Sorry, so I'm just getting down the questions here. From LDQ, you have a Technomancer pull a level fuck you sprite. How do you present a threat without fudging the dice?
Well, let's talk about that when we talk about countermeasures.
Yes, that's
Just
going to
keep
be a
that
whole
one floating.
section.
I've got an entire thing that I'm gonna do there.
But do note that one down. We want to get back to it.
Yeah,
I'm writing down all the questions.
excellent. All right.
Got answers.
See, what does it take to create a host?
Narratively.
The
Narratively.
simple.
Know
Narrative.
what
I
it's-
was about to say.
Know what it's for. Know what you want it to look like. Have a description for the active ice at the time they're running into it. Don't worry too much about the rest of the ice tray. They'll probably never see it. But, if it's an office building, patrol might be a uniformed guard with a big friendly smile. It might be a guy in his German fiction, or German Shepherd, German fiction. It could be patrol and bloodhound or something. So you want to know what it's going to look like. And you'd like to know what the host is generally for. Is it strictly corporate commercial, mostly customers are going to be there? Is it R&D? All of that should color your description. And, if they've got a corporate culture that favors, if it's a Japanicorp and they favor that, maybe it's sculpted as a shrine. Maybe it's sculpted as a garden. Maybe it's sculpted as whatever.
You clarified a bit. You said, what does it take for a corp or a hacker group to basically create their own host? Which I'm guessing
Now,
that gets into foundation.
Black magic, and we might talk about that a little in this presentation later.
Yeah,
Foundation shit. Foundation.
That gets into deeper stuff that may not show up in this presentation.
Is that a clarification for question 7 or a previous one?
That is a clarification for creating a host.
For question 2.
Question 2.
So, but we'll move on to three.
A simple
Okay.
a simple answer is they grow.
Yes.
Mhm.
So, is a host sculpting purely cosmetic, or does it cause a pseudo-physical aspect to the matrix as well?
You should have your decker move through a host, even though technically, mechanically, it is just a box full of stuff.
So it's pseudo-physical.
It has sensation. They have all of their senses.
That's what sense is.
So it's physical enough to interact with. You can drink drinks. You can hold stuff. You could touch a desk. But you could also walk through the desk if you really wanted to. So not really...
Arguable. That is arguable.
Well, you can kind of ignore the sculpting to a large degree in a normal host. So, sort
You
of.
can certainly hack through it.
Let's just say it varies.
It varies.
Yeah.
GM Fiat. And that sort of covers into, can you play with things like location, terrain, and line of sight on the Matrix? Although line of sight on the Matrix is a good thing for Freddy to cover.
Number 4, you make it sound scary.
Yeah, it's all about your description. If it's a ghost story you're aiming for, You can describe the setting. It's dark, it's gloomy, you can't see things. There's a sense of movement. You see eyes. All of the normal things you would do in a physical run, you can actually do in the Matrix to large degree in your narration of the sculpting, the how it comes across to the character.
Also, reputation. You're going to hack host of X person or X corporation. Oh my God, you got to be careful.
Yep.
In their legwork
MCT.
section, in their legwork section, you could have it find out that they just finished silencing some poor bastard. They took him in and interrogated him for 4 weeks because he fucked up, and they.
Yeah. So
The one that I love to do to really set people on edge as far as Matrix, iconography goes, is make it alien and outside of the norm, right? Like it's beautiful if you're have this friendly security guard walking around, but it's even better when the next piece of ice that comes out is a ball of complex data that's constantly flickering in and out together, and you think to yourself, that thing is going to hurt if it touches me. Play with the alien because you have an option to do so on the Matrix. That's one of my things that I love to do.
All right.
For number 5,
Yes.
Rabbit already said everything's on the Matrix.
Well,
there are throwbacks, but it's
throwback devices are Matrix tech that is not Matrix. They exist. Anything you can buy a throwback version of.
We will talk about that later.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything on the Is there anything a Matrix operator can do to proactively defend against attacks? How common are godless grids?
You skip number 6.
Number 6 so Matrix 1.0 are offline hosts, as Kilco describes them. They are servers. They do not have any compatibility with modern Matrix. You can still plug into them though and hack them that way.
That's like one of the only.
We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that more later. But basically, there is old stuff that is offline. We'll talk about it later.
Okay.
A TLDR for question 6 is that yes and no. Most current stuff is not hardware based, but there is still some.
So some of these questions are actually, many of these questions are actually answered to some degree later. What I'd like to do is actually go through that. And if they haven't been answered by the time we get to the end, or we hit a section where they directly apply, we hit them then. Or we're going to be repeating information a bunch. Because like this thing about physical hosts is actually on a slide later in the deck.
All right. Do we have any other questions that need covering right now?
Since this is still part of this general category for godless grids, because I don't believe we talk about it anywhere else. Godless grids do not exist. I don't believe.
Sure they do. Well, the whole grid, no, but godless hosts.
Yes, godless hosts exist, but not entire grid. Though there are weirdness we might cover later with things co-opting the control god.
The deep matrix is also technically a godless grid. It's kind of a gridless matrix, really, but it does not have god.
Okay, it's looking like we got 2 more minutes for questions if anyone wants to get any last ones in.
Yes. So.
Okay. So let's start moving. We've got Johnny. He's in his host.
Mm-hmm. So we've popped Johnny into his host. We've described to him the host and what it looks like. He's noted the friendly security guard floating around, and the first thing he has to do, as with anything on the Matrix, the information exists out there. It's finding it that's difficult. So he's going to do himself a Matrix perception check. Do I want
Matrix search, sir?
Yes, Matrix search. Thank you. Yes.
So, most of you are familiar with Matrix searches on the player side of things. From a GM side, you need to know first, is the data even in that host, right? Sometimes they'll be like, hey, this person got kidnapped. The host will know. If they got the wrong place, they can't find it, no matter how well they roll. But just like on the outside Matrix searches, thresholds are real. They say how hard it's going to be to find, but time changes in a host. When you do a search in a host, the maximum time for any search is a minute. So a tier 6, a threshold 6 search takes a minute, not 12 hours. Divided by successes is normal. So The GM will know that it's there or not, what threshold it can be found at. The player gets to choose how hard they're going to try, what threshold they're aiming for, and then each extra hit divides the time by 2. Some things add divisors like Analytic Mind, Brilliant Heuristics, and the Browse app program. To browse? Search?
Yes.
Browse.
Browse.
Search, I believe, is actually a program, but that's for looking for specific information.
Yeah. You can have, an important thing to note is, you can have your Johnson supply them with a tailored search program to make it easier to find
Yes.
a target.
Yeah, search was the one that was tailored for specific data, and quite often, it was popular at least with Johnsons who want that specific.
This can make it easier on deckers in the party that aren't great deckers, but can maybe get in and survive as long as their edge lasts to allow them to.
So, browse divides it by 2, or divides it by half. Search adds 2 dice. They're similar but easy.
Okay. All right. And the other important detail about matrix searches is the time it's going to take. So, because we know that it's always going to take a minute inside of a host, it takes different amounts of time outside of hosts, and it's divided by net hits. And it can only go down as low as a single combat turn. Now, a single combat turn is not a huge amount, but on the matrix, it's an eon. Now, our Johnny Shadowrunner is going to go for a bit of a wander. He's going to float around the host a little bit. Now, as far as he has been told, they're going to be keeping this file up in the archive section. Well, I use the term archive to represent a room inside the building, but it has a different meaning on the matrix. But it's going to be held in the archive room, and he's going to go for a bit of a wander. He floats on up, and he wanders into the archive room and starts pilfering through files. Now, there's an entire combat turn going on here, so during that time, the friendly security guard comes for a wander past. Now, he is the wander security guard does a little look around the room to make sure everyone's doing the right thing. And do we want to talk about opposed matrix perception checks here, or?
Well, we'll talk about it here because the ice is trying to find him. So when you're running silent, you can be detected by somebody else doing a matrix perception. In a host, you can find any other silent icon that's in the host with you. Outside of a host, you have to be within 100 meters of your actual physical body, so it can be quite hard to find silent things sometimes outside. But in here, the ice is looking for you and gets a shot at it just because you're in the same host with the ice.
A bit of correction on that. One of the matrix perception questions you can ask involves finding devices outside of 100 meters.
Okay, but yeah, we have a little test here, and there's a tense moment when Johnny Shadowrunner is flicking through files and rifling through folder icons, looking for the one he's after, where he swears for a moment that the patrol ice was looking right at him. Right, he could feel the patrol ice's eyes. He could see them looking right at his spot, and for a split second, he swears he's in trouble. Before the patrol ice just looks away and continues walking around the rest of the corner. And Johnny Shadowrunner lets out a huge sigh of relief because he did not want to get spotted this early on. So he takes a huge sigh of relief and he keeps looking. And because he is as Noverhard as he seems to think he is, well, that's still up to the question at this point. He manages to find the file that he's looking for. His fixer gave him the exact specifications of the file, and he managed to track it down. It was on the host after all. But there's a first thing that we do before we do anything with a file. We've located the file, and Johnny Shadowrunner knows the next thing we have to do, a matrix perception check, and he wants to ask a couple of questions before he goes any further with the file. He wants to know if there's a data bomb on the file, and whether the file is encrypted or not, and he also wants to know the rating of those two things. Do we want to talk about data bombs first?
Well, I want to talk about matrix perceptioning files because this is something that it will surprise you that some matrix veterans still forget from time to time. And one of the things I like to do, especially for newer deckers, is to allow a point of common sense if they do forget, because it can derail the data steal and indeed the entire run, depending on your design, very easily.
And on that note, I'll say if you are a brand new decker, common sense is only 2 points of karma. It's like 2 points.
It's 3
Take
points.
it for this exact reason.
It's 3
right?
points, but yeah.
Yeah, like take it for this exact reason because you'll be surprised how often you forget to check a file, and in some cases, people will just blow them up in your face, and it's bad. It's bad, bad, bad.
Because I know that I have blown up several people for that mistake, and I myself have gotten blown up for that mistake. And not only can you blow yourself up, but you can blow up the file that you're trying to steal.
So, as GMs, presumed confidence, assume that they are professionals and they've done things like this. Works to a point. Just common sense is great in semi-primes. If they're running in primes, you don't have to remind them.
Or semi-primes.
Yeah.
However, assumed competence for looking for data bombs does not apply if you're doing it in combat.
Yeah, if they're getting in a hurry and things are sniping at them and the world's falling on them, you can let them get in a hurry and make mistakes and blow themselves up. But particularly in the higher threat runs, which are very, very popular, I know it makes us sad when the players do crazy things that are going to explode themselves, but at that level, it's okay to let them fail if they get happy with themselves and forget. I've blown myself up a couple times.
It doesn't make me sad.
Another thing, please remember that disarm data bomb, that some of these tests cannot be done by sprites. We have had some expert sprite herders forget that, tell their sprite, go in here, do this, and they don't have the skills to even try.
So, do we want to actually talk about what a bomb can't do and what it is before we go any further?
Well, one of the extra questions that they might want to ask is not just, is it bomb, but if they get a bomb, ask, will it destroy the file? Data bombs don't have to destroy the file, and data bombs do not, by default, reset.
Also, we're finding out the rating of the bomb, and the rating is not just a determination of how much damage the bomb can do, but it's also how difficult it is to break. But moving on, Johnny finds out that it's a nice little rating 4 bomb, and he's feeling pretty Nova hot, even though it's a bomb, so he's treating it with the right amount of respect, because he does know they hurt, and more importantly, it could damage the precious file he's after. He's Nova hot, but he's not stupid, so he prepares his deck, he sews everything over the firewall, and he takes a deep breath and holds it, so that he knows he doesn't have to hold his breath, because it's SimSense. But part of him just automatically holds his breath as he goes to disarm the bomb. And luckily for him, there's a split second where he swears to God the bomb started to tick down, but just there was a split second he might have been imagining it as far as he knows, because the bomb just falls off the file, and he breathes a sigh of relief. So we've got the bomb off the file. We've done a major perception check, and at this point I'll actually mention that as a GM, you should be counting actions, because there are going to be about 3 to 4 actions in a combat turn, and if you want to keep track of combat turns, that's how you do it. So he's breathed the sigh of relief as he's dropped the bomb off the file, and he's got to work on the next thing, which is the encryption of the file. So he knows the rating of the encryption, and the encryption is quite low. It's a little rating 4, and he's Nova hot as far as he can tell. He hasn't been caught yet, so he must be as good as he thinks he is. So you can't make any changes to a file without being the files while it's encrypted, so we're going to have to remove the encryption. Which is an attack action. Should we talk about decryption at this point?
Well, there's not a lot to say about decryption. It's an action. I guess there is one important thing. So it's an attack action. So yes, crack file is an attack action, which means if you succeed, the target of the event is told they're being attacked. I'd like to remind you that it's a file. As GMs, you get a lot of control over what happens with that, but it's not a person, it's a file. It's not a persona, it's not ICE, it's not the host itself. So what I usually do with my approach to make it not instant combat timer is the file will log that it's been done to, and how fast that log gets checked depends on the security profile of wherever it is. If they're totally on top of things, maybe it's a minute, maybe it's 5 minutes, maybe it's longer. Because it's getting logged to a file, if the hacker's on top of things and they've already found the file, maybe they can erase that it ever got hacked, although that may set up a different alert which might log to the same file. But again, just because successful attack limited actions warn the target they're under attack, keep in mind who the target is, whether it's a file or a newbie or just some guy on the street or what, because it doesn't always mean game over, ice spawns out of the everything.
Absolutely. Okay. So, our friend Johnny Shadowrunner, he thinks that he thinks he's never hot and he hasn't been disproven yet. So he takes a good crack at this file, and the little lock icon that's symbolizes the encryption cracks open for him, and he breathes a sigh of relief. Just as around the corner comes that nice, friendly patrol ice again, and does another sweep. And this time, there is no doubt in Johnny Shadowrunner's mind that he has been spotted. There is no doubt, because immediately the patrol ice looks at him, and the next thing that happens in this case is a message is sent off, and we get a silent alarm going off. So Johnny is in some big trouble right now. Maybe he's not as Nova hot as he thinks he is. He's got a choice to make at this point, and this is a point like that you should talk with your player out of character or like in character and explain to them what their options are if it's their first run, or even if it's their 50th run. They probably know the deal. That you've got the encryption off the file. As far as you know, the file is here, and that might change. It might get re-encrypted. It might get rebombed later, or they might up the security. So we can pull out at this point. He's been spotted. We could pull out and we could reset and we could come back another day when everything's chilled out. Or we could keep going. And this is the thing you would want to talk to about with not only the player, but the character would need to make the decision. All of these things will have to be taken into consideration. But Johnny, yeah, he's only had one failure so far, ignoring that outside one. We're not talking about that one. He's only had one failure so far. He's still Nova hot. So we're going to give it a crack. Especially because he only has one action he needs to perform left, an edit file action. Now, the host at this point is loading up another ICE program, and Johnny has a feeling that if this host does have a spider on it, he's got a feeling that the spider's going to come along, but he's going to give this a crack. He only needs to make one more action, then he can leave this host. So he rolls up an edit file action, which is a data processing action. So there are very few negatives involved in failing it, which is good because he does immediately. You'll be surprised how often this happens, GMs, where your player will get completely stuck on an edit file action, and it can last turns, and the ice could be right beside them while they're trying to edit this file. So make sure you make them do it, because it's hilarious to watch someone fail at an edit file action 10 times in a row. But boom, nothing. And at this point, on the corner of his eyes, as he's trying to focus on this file, in comes a security spider who is dressed in the same corporate uniform, but once again, we describe him when he comes into the scene as if any other actor had come into the scene. He's dressed in the corporate uniform, but he has that punk leaning that you can tell. He's wearing the big combat boots with steel cap toes and the pink mohawk, right? He might be corporate, but you got a feeling that he's not just some wage slave with a few extra days of training, right? And he looks hungry and ready to. He looks hungry, and he looks like he's ready to kill, not just to tag and bag, right? But this is important: is that you describe the NPC and what their intentions appear to be from the look. If it's a, we won't go any further than that. But, and he's coming, right? He's coming, and he's got a big ball of data spike with Johnny Shadowrunner's name on it. Should we talk about Matrix spotting at this point, actually? Matrix line of sight, rather. Because the patrol ice has spotted him. So if we
Well,
talk
so
about
the simple thing is that once you've been spotted, you're going to stay spotted unless you take a hide action or enter or leave a host or disconnect or something. You can't just hide in the sculpting. You can't close the door on it and be like, "Phew, I'm safe." Um, and you can fail hide actions quite. Uh, Ice will share marks and awareness with all the other ice. Spiders and other defending hackers, the player opt for, they don't get free information from the ice. So you might have a situation where Patrol, Bloodhound, and Black Ice all know exactly where the target is and they're trying to kill it. And the spider's going, shit, I know there's an attacker here, but I can't quite find him. You don't have to announce anything about them finding it either. Ice will usually move directly to do whatever it's going to do and announce, hey, I've spotted you. A KG hacker, an opposition hacker, might watch you to see what you're doing, start a trace, and not announce to the world that there's an invasion going on. They might interrogate your icon for information about you. There could be a lot of stuff going on where the player hacker doesn't even know they're in jeopardy yet.
But in this exact case, there's no way the spider is coming over to have a chat with Johnny Shadowrunner. Johnny Shadowrunner knows this, but we're going to go for the last edit file action. And this time he's successful. I don't know. He doesn't know what the problem was last time, right? But something happened last time, a little hiccup that he couldn't quite control. This time he manages to get a thing, and he manages to make his few edits. He's got one last thing he needs to do, but between him and getting out of here is an entire combat round. At this point, I'll mention to you, GMs, that you don't need to roll up initiative for this. You can just have the action happen and then have a few data spikes thrown at them and then have the player act again. But that's up to you.
Keep in mind your players may want the comfort of formal initiative, but again, when you go to initiative, things get slow. So,
the simple answer is talk to your player, right? If your player is happy to go with me first, then the opposition, or if the player is happy to go with average, that's fine. But if you're in doubt, just ask the player. They might want to roll it up. So we get our edit done, and between us and an exit is another round of action. The patrol keeps an eye out. The spider had, in the last round of actions, managed to track down Johnny Shadowrunner, and in this round of action is going to hurl a bolt of quite nasty-looking code towards Johnny. Johnny throws on his full matrix defense because he knows that he's only got this next action to get out of here, so he gets to throw his matrix defense on, and there's a moment where Johnny swears that there's the tiny little fraction of code that just grazes him, but the data spike flies straight past him, and Johnny exits the host and jumps down into AR as quickly as possible. He's worried that someone's following him, so he waits a little bit. As far as you can tell, no one's followed him outside of the host. So then he jumps off to AR, resets his deck, and probably gets on his motorcycle and gets out of the motel he's in and goes to another motel just in case. But he's got the file. He sends it off to his fixer, and he gets his pay done. Now, is there anything else that I should have covered during that section? Fraythier or Rabbit? Spear?
So, one of the things that can complicate the getaway is link lock. If you're link locked, you can't just disconnect.
You have to hit them for link lock to apply them.
You do have to hit them for link lock to apply. I guess an important thing is that full matrix defense is a very common practice. Don't give them bonuses to things that aren't full matrix actions. It's not. They don't get the bonus to everything that's an attack action. They get the bonus to cyber combat.
Yes, the actions that deal damage essentially.
So if I'm putting a mark on you, you can't full matrix defense out from under the mark, but you can totally full matrix defense out from under the data spike that comes. Yes, and as has been going on in the side chat, erase major signature is an attack action. It won't inform anybody but the signature that it's under attack if you're succeeding, but it does generate overwatch, so the resistance can actually push you into convergence, and failing it will get damage thrown back at you, even though it's just a signature.
I love the idea of a Technomancer getting converged on, trying to erase their matrix signature.
Well, yeah, and erase mark is another one that's kind of a pain in the ass that can get you bricked. Star has almost blown himself directly dead from erasing a mark.
So if we've got nothing else to cover about this, do we want to take some questions before we move on to what happens with the Technomancer, or should we go with the Technomancer and
We should move on.
Yeah, we should move on.
Okay, all right. Okay, so we'll jump over to the next slide, and we will discuss exactly what happens if you take a Techno on the same run that we just took Johnny Technomancer. Now, I'm generalizing. I'm going to generalize a lot here, right? And the reason why I'm generalizing is because as GMs, you need to know the general layout, and then you should definitely do research for specifics. But in general, don't send me your fucking character sheets. I don't care about your character sheet. But in general, a Technomancer is going to have a lower dice pool than a Decker. Don't send me your character sheets. No one send me that. I don't care. So when our Technomancer gets to the outside of the host, he realizes it's a rating 5, and he might have a few more troubles than our friend Johnny Technomancer. So he throws up he throws out a hack on the fly action, and he bounces off. Takes a exasperated sigh, jumps off, resets his deck, and he comes back on. Boom! He does it again. He fails again. Jumps off, resets his deck. I suppose at this point, Rabbit, I'll throw it over to you about how you deal with people bouncing off the outside, if you want to take a side.
So, hosts will experience failed actions like that several dozens of times on a daily basis, to thousands of times, depending on the size and, popularity of the host. If your hacker bounces off the host more than a few times, I like to send somebody out just to do a quick look around, and they can see a matrix perception, can see your last matrix action. So if you get caught standing outside of a host that has recently had several things bounce off of it, and your last action was hack on the fly, then you may get your persona noted by that spider, or whoever it is that comes to hang out. But for the most part, nobody's going to care until you actually get inside the host.
That's up to you and up to your host sculpting and what the host is protecting and who's running the host. Your choice is how you run that. But our Techno has jumped off twice at this point, and he's jumping back on again, and he takes another crack at it, and finally he manages to get it. And he gets onto the host, and once again we describe the host to the person before we do anything further, and we go on to our matrix search. Now the matrix search happens the same way. And the same thing happens where the patrol ice goes for a wander past, and the Technomancer feels the eyes on the back of his neck. But then a Technomancer comes up to the file, and here's the big difference between a Technomancer and a Decker. Because the Technomancer comes along to the file and uses a complex form called editor. Do we want to talk about complex forms?
Well, complex forms are analogous to spells. The important thing to know about editor mechanically is that it lets you directly access the file without having to worry about encryption or data bombs. So if I roll up onto a file that's owned by somebody else, I can copy it with editor, I can change it right where it sits with editor, I can erase it with editor, I can do all that with editor if I can beat the numbers on it. Please do keep in mind that the numbers that you're using to resist are the file owner's numbers, which may or may not have anything to do with the host's numbers.
So our Technomancer comes on in, sprinkles a little matrix magic on the file. Quick note for you GMs. Make your Technomancer. Now, Technomancy, just like magic, does not have to have any physical apparition at all. But if they do, ask them to describe it. Once again, let's not have this be a black void. But they sprinkle a little matrix magic on the top, a little bit of fairy dust, which I'm going to start calling it now from now on, right there. And the file is edited as if by magic. Now, should we talk about the difference between resonance actions and matrix actions, or should I just go with it?
Just go with it. We'll talk about
Just
that
go
later.
with it. Because it was not a successful attack action. It was not a successful sleaze action. It was not a successful data processing or firewall action. It just happened, right? And unless another technomancer comes by in the next few minutes and reads the matrix signature
Few
and works out
hours.
few hours and works out exactly what's going to happen, the file just edited itself as far as anyone can tell. Now, the technomancer takes a second, because as far as he can tell, he's fine, to smudge away his signature, and he exits the host. I'll actually throw this one over to you, Rabid, about erasing matrix signatures, if you want to throw some ideas out there for people.
Well, erasing your resonance signature, we covered it earlier. It's an attack action. You can get yourself converged. You can do damage to yourself if you are not careful, which is one good reason not to go throwing around rating level 10 complex forms, rather, even though you're a big bad Resonance 6 Technomancer. But there are a couple other pretty useful complex forms. One specifically that we did not, that Anthony skipped over a little bit when we were covering this, is Cleaner. Now, the theory there is that once you get into the host, you take that Overwatch score that you accumulated to get in, and you clean it off. And then it is not accumulating, so no matter how long you spend in the host, as long as the IC doesn't find you, your Overwatch does not keep ticking up, which is one of the major exploits that Technomancers will use in these sorts of situations.
Yeah, I totally forgot about that one. That's okay, though. The important detail is that our Technomancer has plenty of time at this point, as far as you can tell, to erase the matrix signature. Matrix signatures do disappear on their own, but they disappear in hours, which is an infinite amount of time on the matrix and too long to leave it there. Remember, guys, if they're on the run, they might not get a chance to remove their signatures, and feel free to play around with that. But our Technomancer has made the edits, and he's got 0 Overwatch score, because he's cleaned it himself off beforehand. And in between, every now and again, he does some edit file actions or matrix search actions. So as far as someone could tell, he hasn't done anything illegal, and he just exits the host, happy as like the day he was born, and cashes in the money immediately. So the important detail about all of this, folks, is be aware of the difference between Technomancers and Deckers when you pick them for your runs.
Technomancers can also act just like Deckers, though.
Absolutely. But
They
be
do have
aware
a
of the
tendency to
difference.
cheat.
Yeah,
There's
be
also
aware of the difference.
There's also a specific archetype for Decker Technomancer.
Absolutely. Yeah, be aware of the difference, and be aware when you're making your picks for your runs of the difference and what the player character can do. And if you are in trouble and you don't know, ask the player. The player will tell you what their character can and cannot do, so that you know when you're building your encounters what they are capable of doing and what they will be able to circumvent, what they will not be able to circumvent. So,
Couple final parts before we move on the slides, or at least a couple extras. As GMs, remember to exploit mistakes that the players make, but don't go out of your way to try to be an omniscient enemy. So, if the player's making an obvious bad play, they've left tons of signature around, they haven't even considered it, it's a normal run, they have common sense. There's a lot of reasons why you can remind them, hey, do you care that your signature's all over everywhere? Because they may actually care. But if you say that and they're like, no, I'm good, and they leave it, or they have every reason to believe from legwork that there's a complicated logging system that they should clean up, and they ignore that information, you can let them make the mistake. But you shouldn't be like looking for things to leap on to screw them with. But you also shouldn't avoid having their mistakes actually matter.
All right.
So I suppose at this point we should take some questions, shall we?
Well, we want to make sure that we actually get through the whole presentation. Do we have new questions? Because we can collect these questions and try to roll through them quickly at the end too.
A lot of y'all have been pretty good about answering things in the chat currently. I don't believe.
Been trying to.
Yeah, I don't believe we have any new ones, but we can give it a minute.
A quick, since people are talking about technomancers, technomancers who use actual decks, unless they're using a kit-bashed sleeper, they can't do resonance stuff. They can't do complex forms. They can't compile sprites. If you have resonance writing, the wording on that echo is terrible. It has very clearly drawn lines of what you can't do, and very few things would fit into what you can do. And assume that a technomancer on a deck that is not a kit-bashed sleeper can't do the tricky stuff with resonance, except maybe echoes.
They can also command sprites.
Yeah, they can send messages to their sprites.
No, I'm talking about if they have resonance writing echo, they can command sprites normal.
Right. Because sprites can be loaned, they can set up already compiled and registered sprites to listen to them, but by and large, they hinder themselves greatly by being on a deck.
Well,
Okay.
they do not need to do that, even if they have the resonance writing.
Well, I'm talking about if they don't have resonance writing, yes. Like a stock technomancer, non-submerged.
Charging Technomancer. Or Technomancer.
You will find some people who have low stats or a bad living persona, or they just don't want to risk it, or they know there's biofeedback and they don't want to be crushed, that use a deck. But it does limit their engagement to normal. And sometimes the player will forget and try to do their cool stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any more quick questions about what we just covered? Gonna give it a minute.
Okay.
So you can have them running AGA. So the question was, can you have multiple devices running even if they don't have your persona on them? Some functions will work fine, some functions won't, right? So comlinks can continue to broadcast your SYN. Comlinks can take phone calls, but you can't interact with the matrix through a comlink unless your persona's on it. An RCC can have a bunch of drones slave to it, and you can have the RCC, you can send a message out.
No, you can directly control the RCC without your.
Right. I was giving a longer list, but yes, you can do things through your RCC. You can't jump into stuff without jumping into it, though. Your persona has to move into a device to jump into it. But you can send a drone commands too. So there are a lot of things that you can do. We're not going to answer if TM should burn out because that's a subjective question and has nothing to do with how to run the matrix.
Yes.
Although, honestly, if you burn them out and turn them into flower pots, MCT will thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if they're flower pots, you can't make them into biological ice that uses resonance.
Sure you can. Just need to get more creative.
I would move that question to Carriage in chat.
Yep.
Theory crafting.
Or
Either
theory
or.
crafting, that works too.
Either or.
Do we have any other questions, or should we move on?
We should move on.
Yes, I think we should move on. Okay, so moving on.
Mm-hmm.
Technomancers.
Yes. Okay, yeah, so here's what we were talking about before. The big difference between matrix actions and resonance actions. People know what a matrix action looks like when it happens or when it fails. That doesn't happen with a resonance action. So people who might have gotten training they know that if they get attacked, that their comlink's firewall plays up and it announces that there's been an attack. Resonance action, that doesn't happen.
The exception to that rule being the use of the Wuxing frequency comlink. It allows you to, with 5 hits on a matrix perception test, notice a persona is resonant, or notice things like resonance signatures and such. It's a very specific piece of gear that CorpSec love to implement in the right circumstances.
Yep, and then we have the resonance entities, sprites, null sex, other technomancers, technocritters as well.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah. If you've got resonance, you can notice resonance in action. If you don't have resonance, you generally can't. The frequency can say, "Hey, it's a technomancer. I myself have been caught by one. That kind of sucked." And the null sect, the null sect can totally notice you, and they totally like to pay special attention to you. However, they're not actually resonant or anything, so they get to notice you, not necessarily the things you're doing.
Is that actually stated?
Yeah, they have a scanning. There's a scanning mechanic.
Because it is stated also that they cannot actually. They hate the resonance. They want to destroy the resonance. They can't actually touch the resonance.
Correct, but they can see it. So there is, and I'll pull up a page reference while we're moving through. There is a check for null to actively see that you're a technomancer.
Check the little handout I gave, because I gave all the page references to the nullsec stuff, but I'm sure you've got your own. Okay. Do we want to jump ahead to the next one?
Yes.
And this is all you, right, baby?
Oh, yes. My favorite. So, going to get into a little more specific about how hackers can affect the meat space, and especially during firefights and other sort of more physical incursions. First point is calibrate. Calibrate's a wonderful little data processing action you can do on yourself and your teammates, anyone that you have proper marks on their personas, to increase their initiative. You make their matrix things run faster, and it makes everything run faster. I Am the Firewall is a fantastic and probably a tad overpowered defensive action. It lets you add your hits on a computer test to the defense for everyone that you have marks on their pen, that you have access to other things. You can see through their wear, anything like that.
Quick note on that: adds to the hits add to their dice, not their hits.
Yes, it increases their defense pool. It doesn't give them free defense hits. That's a good thing to note. Intervene. That is another action that increases the defense. Just moving on, Squelch. Squelch is one of those wonderful actions for when you're doing your infiltrations. Squelch causes the target device to not be able to send messages for a number of minutes equal to the net hits. It is an attack action, however, because even if it succeeds and they are notified of a successful attack action, they can't exactly.
They don't automatically
Yes.
know that they've been squelched. They know something happened.
Yes.
It is easy for normal people to misidentify what exactly happened until they actually try to send a message.
Yeah. It looks like you lost your reception or something similar. It's not automatically suspicious, and it definitely automatically doesn't alert the powers that be. Pop-up is a fun one. Pop-up targets people running AR, so most people. You can fill their AR feed with junk and spam and, ads from porn websites and all sorts of things to distract them in a firefight and make them aim very poorly or just miss things. So for infrastructure, something we've talked about a lot so far, it is an action you take against the host, which means you don't have to be in the host to do it. It lets you it lets you control little simple devices like cameras and other things, scanners, vending machines, things like that. Just as really simple as it's a streamlining action. You can save a lot of time on your matrix by using this on your table, and I highly recommend everybody use this on your table, because taking 15 minutes just to subvert one camera is kind of a pain in the ass, in my personal opinion. Now, next down on the list we have is Tag. Tag is a wonderful action that allows you to put an AR marker over a device. You can use it to reduce a certain amount of visual penalties to combat characters when they're shooting at things. It's also just good for generally pointing out where things are for your infiltrator so the guard doesn't get the drop on them by accident. Finally, Watchdog. Watchdog is a action that places a mark on the target device, and it lets you know when the target device does something like send a message. At which point you can spend an interrupt to squelch them before that message can get out.
An important thing to note on this is because you're the GMs, don't forget that you can do these things for your own team. And if their hacker is AWOL or they don't have one at all, if they don't have one at all, I would recommend you not really lean on these because they can be kind of overpowering. But if, for example, they've been spotted casing a joint and somebody hacked a comlink, putting a watchdog or a watchdog mark on them and then like snooping the comms of the actual party, that's totally legit.
Or even squelching the guy that was doing the recon and then blackbagging him before he can tell his team that he's been made, and then getting information that way. All the corps that can be just as devious as runners if you think creatively enough and you feel like making your players' lives hell.
Try to only do that at higher professional ratings, please.
Yeah.
But don't forget that you can.
So, moving on. Grids, which we talked about a little bit, but they are largely meaningless now.
They are largely meaningless now. Kill Code has made that pretty clear, and to be fair, they were pretty meaningless before. Now, you've got the specific thing here. There's public grid dice pool penalty, which shouldn't worry you if you're a decker, because you should never be there. And the transit grid complex form has its uses. I've never personally even used it, so if someone's got some actual uses.
There are a couple things Transcendent Grid can cover, and there are still a couple of corner cases. There are complex forms that will hurt you more depending on if you're on the same grid or not. So it can matter. It is highly unlikely to matter unless you're on the public.
So, easy answer to grids is don't worry about them too much, because they don't do a lot.
The one thing I would... Oh, go on, sorry, Faito?
I would say the biggest thing is for description and feel. If they're in the Emerald City, if they're in Seattle, they're on the M City grid, it mechanically doesn't matter at all, but narratively it can matter a lot. If you're in Neo Tokyo, having a local be on the local grid for Neo Tokyo is going to matter more for getting the feel that they're not at home. They're somewhere else, even though they're still in their living room or in their van or something. It can matter for that. And likewise, corporate grids, if you're on a Big Ten and you're in MCT space and you're a hacker, you're already a fool. So playing up the MCT part and having that looming menace of the people who take great joy in showing why you shouldn't actually hack their shit can have a narrative impact on the feel and the threat feel of the run.
Absolutely. I think it's an important step as well when you're actually doing a Matrix run to ground, quote unquote ground. It's the exact opposite of grounding someone. It's reminding people that they have left their bodies behind and they are now this free floating piece of data, information streaming through the Matrix. I think it's an important step to take. The first thing you do before you do anything else to make people remember that, oh, that's right, I have freed myself of my mortal coil and now I am information incarnate. And from there into the host, it allows you to basically get people ready to be a Matrix entity for a bit. Nice little waiting room.
Yes, so moving on. My favorite section, how to kill those pesky hackers, and I'm just going to take this one because it's my favorite. So, Op 4 for your Matrix sections of your run and your Matrix runs. We divide this into a couple of different segments, namely metahuman and automated. Metahuman threats, the most common thing you're going to see are spiders. Spiders are hackers, usually deckers, occasionally technomancers, that take up residence in a host, and their job is to protect that host. They will do all kinds of tricky things. They're generally the ones that have dictated the behavior, or the layout of the IC. They are in charge of setting up the security protocols. They know all the security protocols, and they're in charge of keeping it safe. And they are not always overhanded about it. So do not be afraid to do things like having your spiders run silent, like Frey mentioned earlier, having them lurk on enemy deckers once they see them, especially if the IC hasn't spotted them yet, and trigger that automatic alert. The other types we have are the more overt, offensive metahuman hackers, which are troubleshooters. And demigods are basically an extreme version of a troubleshooter. A troubleshooter is a hacker who specializes in fucking you up. They will come in. They will try to lock you down. They will throw data spikes at you if they're particularly not nice. They will throw biofeedback at you at the same time. They're the HTR of the Matrix, more or less. And that's how you should think about them, because they are here to hurt you. They're not here to protect anything. They're gunning for you.
They
Now,
also might be technomancers if they suspect a technomancer break-in.
absolutely, there are absolute technomancer demigods and technomancer troubleshooters out there. Automated threats, you have IC. IC are very dumb programs. They have a singular set of behavior that they do. Patrols, obviously we talked about Patrol and Bloodhound. They circle around the host and they look for silent icons and things. And when they see one, they just yell about it and make the other IC do what they do, which varies. Some IC will damage you, some IC will mark you, some IC will even reduce your matrix attributes, which in combination with other tactics can be very nasty, because it is no fun trying to jack out of a host when your firewall has been reduced to 0.
Absolutely. The other one that I'd like to throw in here too is don't underestimate having an agent. It can complicate things.
Yes.
If your target has an agent, they can complicate things.
Given so and agents can run on hosts as well. They're not really there in a defensive capacity. A lot of times they just serve as automated help desk. They could tattle on you, but they're generally there to serve as something like an automated help desk, or just to run some kind of function. They're not really a security feature usually. The other automated threat is your Overwatch score. Now, obviously, we talked about technomancers have less of an issue with this if they know the right tricks, but your Overwatch score can be a pretty big threat. If you have to start suddenly jumping over a lot of hoops and shooting down IC, your Overwatch is going to start going up much faster than you were expecting. If that hits 40 inside of a host, you are going to have a very nasty surprise for you when you walk out and you've been converged on. There's a demigod waiting to kick your ass. Not to mention the fact that it will automatically alert the host even if you have, up to this point, avoided alerting the IC or anybody else directly. The other thing I want to talk about... Sorry, go ahead.
On Overwatch, a few things that I'll mention is you can keep track of the GMs, and I'll ask this of people: does anyone care if their GMs aren't keeping track of Overwatch, and don't want to bother with convergence? I'm asking mainly you, Fraythea.
I care a lot because it's a core mechanic. The other thing is that it greatly distinguishes between the rules of engagement and approach strategies of technos versus deckers. So a decker has no way to dump Overwatch. So what a decker is usually going to do to survive Overwatch is come in, get a thing done, leave. Come in, get a thing done, leave. They have to be targeted, they have to be quick, they have to be on the clock, they have to get it done and go. A techno will be doing shit like, I come in, I do some stuff, I cleaner, I loiter. I can take as long as I want. Nobody cares. I don't care. They don't have to come back later. So Overwatch is a thing to make a decker care, and it's a thing to trip up a TM who's not paying attention. And we've had TMs converge themselves, and it's funny every single time it happens. We've had people with cleaner forget to use it and light themselves up, or, and this is definitely a tip for GMs, remember that action economy is a huge driver for what people opt to do. If you've got them in a combat-related scenario or they're under pressure, they will put off doing routine maintenance like cleaner, and their Overwatch score will build. And there may come a time when their choice is run away, clean up, or get killed, or have a teammate die. And that can force convergence, or force them to risk convergence, and force them to make poor choices because they let the Overwatch score climb. So I never recommend to ignore it. It's an important tool in adding risk or the perception of risk to players.
It's also worth noting that while the vast majority of hackers are going to have a method to actively monitor it, Baby Monitor is probably the second or first most commonly used program on a deck. Active Analytics is a fantastic sprite power, but not it is not going to be a given that they know their Overwatch score at any given time, which is why the check Overwatch score action actually exists. And it is a sleaze action, so it can actually converge you. I have converged people while they're checking their Overwatch score. It's pretty hilarious. So keep that in mind and keep it behind the screen unless they have a reason that they always know it. If they have something like that, I don't do it behind the screen. If they don't, though, it's always behind my screen unless they ask or they get a reasonable, way to find out.
And often, if they're counting it themselves, they'll do math errors or be off by a little bit, and that little bit can make or break.
Yeah, if they're counting it themselves, and that's another reason why, especially on the Matrix, I roll my dice behind my screen, because they can't count for themselves if I do that. They can make an estimated guess, but
Nope.
they can't.
For Aga's question, if you're running Baby Monitor, you just know. So
Yep.
that's why Rabbit's suggesting putting it on the table.
Yes, it's very, very good program. And then also Sprite Power Active Analytics does the same thing. In fact, it works on you and all of your sprites. So
Well, active
it's nice like
analytics
that.
needs to be activated. Yes.
But yes, yeah, it needs to be activated. But rules of engagement. Basically, what I mean by rules of engagement in this context is that depending on what you're hacking and where you are, the rules of engagement of the uproar are going to change. Your standard unrated corporate data host, they're not going to be out to kill you. In fact, they can probably get in trouble for killing you if they don't have a reasonable enough explanation for God later on. They are going to try to track you. They're going to try to keep you out of their stuff until the troubleshoots together. They're going to try to track you so they can tell the proper authorities and they can handle it. A AAA corporate host doesn't have to play by those rules. AAA corporate hosts can run black ice with nasty biofeedback, and they can melt your brain for trying to steal their stuff, and they don't have to answer to anybody about it because they have every right to protect their data to that degree. Another thing to consider is that are going to operate along the same lines usually are organized crime matrix installations, hosts owned by syndicates and other shadowy groups, even littler hosts owned by gangs. Gangs don't care about whether you survive. They're gonna do whatever they can to keep you out. Same thing with the mob. Same thing with the Vori. They're just as brutal in the Matrix as they are in real life. They're going to kill you if that's the best way to keep you out of their stuff.
For GM specifically, because you're gonna set up your big host that you intend people to run against. But if you ever need a basic host to run, the ones that I use on a regular basis are either shoot first, ask questions later, blink lock and then shoot with the intention of absolutely killing you, tag and bag, which is they just try and find out where you are and then call the cops on you, or link lock and tag and bag. Those are like the 4 little shorthands I use for if I need to make up a host then and there.
Yeah, and those are good categories to fall into. Until you get a better handle on exactly the motivation of what your runners are running against. And it's usually pretty easy to figure out, but it is definitely something to consider that not every host is going to start throwing biofeedback at the problem. But that's a good thing to consider. So moving on, we have how to run God, which is another fun one. So God is worse than HDR. They're very scary. They come right down on you, and they have the ability to do a lot of things to you. They are very good deckers. They have very good equipment, or very well trained technomancers. But the main thing that they do is they come up when you've converged, when your OS is 40, and they are just going to tap you, and you're going to fly out of the Matrix head first, and all kinds of awful things are going to happen at that point, because they're going to automatically trace you. You don't get to resist that stuff, unless you have that one program that everybody hates. Actually, no, that's not even legal here, so not even then. What else do we have on how to run God? Did you guys have anything for this?
Well, I don't have a lot for it. It is important to note that player characters, unless they're going to Zurich Orbital or something, should never be directly interacting with a god or a demigod unless they've truly fucked up or they've gone incredibly loud and escalated a couple times. I think to date, the only time I've seen a demigod on a grid was Rabid because I was being exceedingly stupid and deliberately drawing attention to myself. I had not yet converged, but I totally deserved what I got. So if you actually haul God out to do direct confrontations, It should be forecast and telegraphed as a, oh my God, you're gonna die. And it should not be looked at as a, hey, this is a great challenge. I'll get some bragging rights out of this by them.
Yes, it's very serious when God starts popping up on the grid with you.
As far as some of the side talks, there are enough. You can never make God too busy. They've got enough people to just handle it.
Well, theoretically, you can make them too busy, but it's not something any player is going to.
They have
a mega corporation could probably pull it off.
Yeah, they have a space station full of elite hackers to deal with all Matrix threats on the world simultaneously. They're pretty well covered in that regard. You'd need a lot of manpower to stress God's manpower.
Generally speaking, unless there's some double blind going on with AAA resources, consider God available to respond. The other thing is that, so they're sanctioned. When you're sanctioned by God, you're allowed to do hacks. So there's no reason for them not to do hacks. And they're only the best and most trusted people get sanctioned. If they're God, they can chase you to any grid. They can go to anywhere you want to go. You can pursue them indefinitely if they've got a reason to keep pursuing them.
So,
a corporate hacker probably won't leave his host.
Yeah. But a demigod, in all likelihood, they do not accrue Overwatch score. They are not easy to bribe. They are very skilled. They're a very bad time. And aside from that split second you see them when you get converged on, most Shadowrunners will not see a demigod on a grid. So it's a scary thing. But we can move on from there, and we're going to move on to our next section. Unless you guys want to break for questions again.
No, I think we should keep going.
Okay, let's keep rolling because we don't want to take too long on this.
We're 10 minutes ahead of the last question section.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Doing good.
Okay, so Matrix security. Techno critters are something that gets overlooked a lot and could definitely be utilized as to Matrix security. If they are trained, they are very good at sniffing things out, and they're cheaper than training spiders because cyberdecks are expensive and so is college.
They're cheaper except for all the animal training and such.
Yeah, well, compared to putting a decker through school, it's a lot cheaper.
They both have their own use.
Yeah, absolutely. They're a little less effective, but they're and they're a nice change of pace if you want to make your Matrix segment a little more unique than everyone else's host dive. It's an interesting little thing that your players are gonna go, oh wow, I don't think I've ever seen a person use that on a run.
Quick point of order about that. Don't get too tricky, GMs. Learn the basics first. Like, don't jump right in and be like, oh, I'm gonna have AIs and techno critters all over my first host. Stick to the basics first.
But
Techno critters are a little simpler than AI. But yes.
Yeah. But if you do want to go crazy, we're always here for you. Host types.
Let's stay with techno critters for a second, if you don't mind. Sure. So some corporations actually actively like to use them. As GMs, you'll notice that their stats are kind of crap, but don't forget that they can notice resonance. They can do things like be drawn to disruptive events or complex forms and show defenders something is going on, even if they can't ever find the guy because they don't have the matrix perception to beat a PC's logic sleaze. If they start congregating around the resonance veil that they threw up to fool a piece of ice, or they start clustering around a file because they're trying and failing to editor it, it can draw attention from the actual defenders to come look at it. They can also unsettle people into making poor decisions. Like holographic concealment can have animals that can leap out and ambush people. Then the animal might have a reason to suspect or a reason to just go after something.
So while the basic, I will remind people, while the basic, like, air quote, image for, say, a bastet, the Technocats, is like a house cat, they are in no way limited to that. You can have a bastet that is a...
Techno critters are generally a very sort of, like when you say basset, you say Technocat. Cats can range. A house cat, a great cat. Same thing with a lot of them.
As long as it's not magic, it generally can become a techno critter of that type.
Yeah, my favorite example of this is probably digits, which are emergent insects. They like to make
And
swarm
arachnids.
and arachnids. Yep, and they like to make swarm. Well, yeah, they're arachnids, but they're a little less effective because insects will make swarms, and you can use the E-hive power, which ups their resonance. The bigger the swarm is.
Spiders technically can too.
Yeah, it's a little less common, but yeah, spiders can swarm as well.
Some of the hive mind power.
Yes, and they have the hive mind power.
Don't forget Nezumi. I once startled some people by having Nezumi do a tactical attack from a dumpster on a hacker who wasn't expecting it. There are, again, don't forget that they use intuition for their stuff, not logic, because their logic is artificially low because they're animals. So they usually use intuition. Don't fear giving them stat boosts to make them interesting and or risky, but never, like all my advice on this, give them a strength and keep their weaknesses so that they do not become illogical powerhouses.
Yes, and that's really a good bit of advice for any jamming situation. Don't be afraid to fudge the NPC stats from the books, because the NPCs have from the books in 90% of cases are kind of awful, at least in my opinion. But yeah, so techno critters are nice for that. Host types. We talk about host types now.
So the data host is a standard host that the core rulebook has. Kill Code and Data Trails gave us a lot of new toys, but the host types, so nested hosts are phenomenal and horrific. And I mean that from a mechanical standpoint, a pain in the ass standpoint, and a utility standpoint. They're both the best and the worst. They can give you those multiple rooms that we talked about. They can let you segregate stuff, like you can have a relatively easy host that they're intended to attack, where the novice hacker can actually survive, and have the hardened, super cool host inside. That's where the prototype stuff goes, where the decker's not supposed to go, but could try if they feel like getting killed, and encourage a physical intrusion to get at the data a different way. There's a bunch of stuff you can do with them. They'll touch on the concept of the foundation, because all those nested hosts have a common foundation. It's the outermost one's foundation. Destination hosts are classically like amusement parks. They want you to be in them. They invite a mark. You get to come in, but you can't run silent. It is physically impossible to run silent. So not only are you in plain sight, they assign you personal ice that just keeps you company, like a digital assistant. But it's also patrol ice. So instead of waiting every couple of minutes for patrol, you've got one right there looking over your shoulder the whole time. So destination hosts can make people have to change their tactics a lot. There are the direct connect exploit, and it's an in-character exploit. People consider it cheating, but it's legit. If you're directly connected to a device, you can generally ignore the master's stats and attack the device's stats itself. In an industry host, the rating of the host always matters. In a normal host, if you're inside the host, you are directly connected to all of the devices slaved to the host. So you can directly attack a camera, directly attack a microphone. In an industry host, every single thing in there gets the master's stats. This can turn what would be an easy host into a nightmare host, even for an experienced hacker. They're like, I can handle rating 8s all day. You put them in a rating 8 industry host, it might crush them. So be careful with industry hosts. They also slow the game down like holy shit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the important detail, GMs, is if you are running that host, expect the run to take a lot longer. So, I don't know. Be aware that basically a lot of your table is going to be sitting there waiting for the decker to do his thing.
And there's a major difficulty curve there. Industry hosts are generally used to protect device-heavy setups. A lot of the time, what I'll do is I'll build a host, a data host, a destination host, whatever, and I will nest an industry host inside of it as the security nest to cover cameras and guard comm links and stuff like that. That's high risk target for hackers.
So, to handle the slowdown for industry hosts, remember and selectively encourage, subvert infrastructure as a thing to do. So in an industry host, they have to beat up fucking everything. Since they have to go after it anyway, if there's an industry host, but they need to control several cameras, a subvert still attacks the host, but you only have to do it once, and then now you've got rolling cameras. Subvert infrastructure is like a godsend to party unity and not having the hacker vanish for an hour and a half at a time.
It is the best thing Kilco did for us, in a lot of ways. But
in a really good book,
in a really good book.
like in a book of good things, it did one of the best things was subvert infrastructure.
Say what you will about Catalyst's writing, but yeah, that was a fantastic book for mechanics, matrix wise. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you want to talk more about those? Because we're going to move on into the non-standard host types next.
Yeah, are we doing all the host types right now? We can go to non-standards.
Well, I got them on the slide for notes. We can do it. I think we've got it on a later slide too. So however you want. Let's move on to noise.
Yeah, let's move on to noise. We'll cover the weirder stuff later in the rules bit. So noise is something that I find gets forgotten. I forget it at times, but it's a good thing to note. Technomasters have a little more trouble with it than Deckers on average. Noise is effectively static. It's or spam. It's signal distortion. It makes working on the matrix harder. The most common, instance of noise being distance noise. If you are hacking something that is far away from you, it is harder. There is a penalty. There's ways to reduce that penalty, but not always all the way down. If you're in a host, there's no distance noise. Hosts exist everywhere. So you don't have to worry about how far away you are because the host has no physical location. So you're always not worrying about that. Other things to consider are spam and static zones. If you're trying to hack in the middle of a busy downtown street, there's a lot of matrix activity that can slow you down. If you're trying to hack from out in the boonies, same thing, different flavor. Spam and static zones ratings are noted in the core book. Those are very good guidelines to follow. My go-to easy most common one I've found is the Barons. About 2 noise in the Barons is what I usually go with. That's the easy way to do it. So, and that matters on the target and on the hacker as well. So if the hacker is in the Barons and hacking out of the Barons, you're still going to have to worry about the noise. Same way if the hacker is somewhere relatively quiet and then hacking into the Barons. And it's a good thing. And a lot of lower-end matrix security setups will rely on noise and rely on that public grid penalty to help secure them. It makes it a little harder to get at them when you have to fight through the noise. But most hackers will have a way to get rid of the noise. But not all. So, keep an eye out on that and make sure you remind your players to take that penalty off their noise because they will forget.
Some other commonly forgotten categories of noise. RF paint is a for real thing. And that can keep you from getting at icons inside a building. Landscaping can screw you up, and water is the #1 way to disconnect a Technomancer.
Yes. Putting an aquarium between you and your special thing is a really nice way to really pump up the noise value that your hackers have to deal with. Or, capture your techno, you have them float in a tank of salt water. Then you can't get out because the noise buildup on salt water is something insane, like 1 point per centimeter.
All water does, salt water is worse, Star.
Yes.
And if, from a player perspective, if your techno's eyes roll up into their head and they start spraying blood out their eyes and ears and nose and stuff, put them in a bucket of salt water and you might save their life.
Yeah. Yeah, disconnect.
Unless they're source. It takes 2 buckets for source.
Disconnecting your hacker or Technomancer from the Matrix is not always a bad thing if they're in trouble. It's a good way to get around a link lock if you're desperate. But we talked about spiders already a little bit. I went over them. They're very, very common in Matrix security setups. Fast reacting spiders, spider can have backup that they can call in. Other spiders to help with high stress situations that maybe come in before the troubleshooters. Maybe they're on site, so they're a little quicker than the troubleshooter guys, which are usually going to be off site. And we talked about what all those guys do already. But, keep in mind that that's something that can be done as well. And I think we can move on unless you guys have anything to note that I didn't cover. I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay.
Keep rolling.
Yes, keep rolling. So, what the GM can affect. So, one thing to note when you're planning Matrix bit on your run, your players are very tricky. 90% of the runs that I do, I have to improvise half of it because I predict one player behavior and they come at me with a totally different direction. Fun tricks, common tricks that you'll see. One of my favorite was direct connecting. One of my characters is entirely based around direct connecting to a device, and once broke into a very secure host that he had no business being into by squatting on the roof and plugging his head into a security camera.
Yeah, which was really irritating because the cameras were supposed to be out of his reach, so he jumped from another building and got it.
Yes, because he knows parkour. It's fine. Other fun thing is Fork. Fork is a program that deckers use, and technically us can use it too if they have the right setup. But it lets you apply a matrix action to 2 targets. So it's a really good way to rack up marks really quickly on something like, say, a pan that they're hacking. You find a pan, guy's comlink, and all the devices under it. You fork for 2 of the targets under it, which means that your marks will travel up, so you get marks twice as fast on that comlink. Or on a host, same way. If you're hacking things like that, or just having to deal with multiple things like cameras or scanners. Cameras, obviously, you can subvert, which again we talk about a lot here. But forking, multiple sensor arrays to deal with, a 2-tiered entrance is a really good way to save time. It does not save you on OS though, because both of those devices are going to rack up OS at the same rate. They're both going to roll, and both of the rolls are going to be added to the Overwatch score. But the big thing to remember is everything's a target. You may not think about you may think you have the infiltrator cornered while he's sneaking into the office building until the decker gets in and shuts off the lights, and your infiltrator slips away from the guard before he realizes what's going on. Or maybe they turn on the blender in the break room and the guard looks away for a split second and they get away. Players are creative. You should be creative too. Don't be afraid to say yes to these requests and sort it out, at a later point. Tips for preventing the Matrix to drag on. And we've talked about this before, but I really want to drive it into your head straight to the point. Avoid initiative. Initiative is for combat. Initiative is for situations where there are things shooting at them in the Matrix that could very much damage things. Things where action economy becomes vital to success. And we've talked about stressing the players in those higher threat runs, making them work a little harder.
Absolutely. I'll mention quickly on that point that in a lot of cases we can avoid initiative simply because there aren't a lot of matrix shootouts. Normally the decker just wants to get the thing done and get out and avoid a shootout in all situations. And unless it is a matrix shootout where he is attempting to kill the person back, you can ignore initiative a lot.
Yes, unless it needs to be done, unless they still have actions to do and the ice has their number, the spider has their number. Don't make them roll initiative.
It's also important when time crunch is part of the thing. If they do pre-planning, it's fine. But if they save their, I'll mark that when I get around to it, and things start to come fast and furious, if you give them a couple of actions per response action, it's fine. But if you just let them do whatever they want, there's no pressure. And everything useful, with like 3 exceptions, is a complex action. So when you actually start to put a time pressure on them, and they only get 2 actions before the patrol swings back by, they're going to choose their actions differently than if they just get to roll on with whatever they want to do.
Yep. And
a great shorthand for your GMs if you want to have a real time crunch. Like they have a few things they have to do, but they've already been spotted, right? They have a few things, and you don't want to go into specific initiative combat. Just first things first, before you do any of this, talk to your player. But you can just say 3 to 4 actions per pass, and have either the player go first or work on assumed competent things or assumed initiative, or make them roll and then make them act in order. But there are a lot of shortcuts to making specific action economy work while not doing intense initiative.
Yeah. And really just doing the full initiative thing where we go down the orders, it bogs things down. It leaves people with gaps, worse gaps than you're already going to have doing your matrix segments. So streamline things as much as you can. And again, another thing, make it straightforward. I've done runs that are 100% matrix, that I really enjoyed building puzzles and forcing, the matrix people to solve them. This may not always be the best approach when you have a table that is mostly not matrix people. I enjoy solving puzzles when I play Decker, but not everybody enjoys watching the Decker solve puzzles. So make the path to success relatively simplistic and easy to see. Not too easy depending on threat level, but don't make it too twisty and turny, because you don't want the matrix to drag on for a long time. Do you want to take this last segment, Anthony? How to make your player feel like an elite hacksaw? I know you're all about that.
Yeah. So, one of the things I can give to you all, and this is a piece of advice that I was given early on in my GMing career and has stuck with me for a while, Mr. LDQ, thank you. Don't fear the Decker. Never fear the Decker. While the Decker can manipulate devices everywhere and has access to nearly every piece of information in the world, all that can enable is the rest of the table to work better, right? It is a force multiplier to the rest of the table, no matter what it is that you give them access to. And the more access you give them, the more creative that they will be in response to that, and the more interesting answers you will get back from them, right? We've mentioned before that that we've got lights and halon systems and cameras, and make sure that the Decker is aware of these things. They're always online. Remind the Decker of these things that are around them. If you at any point need to tell them in character, ask them to make a matrix perception check for you, and they will find out these things. Don't fear them. Give them access to whatever it is that they want, unless it's something obvious that they should never have access to. And the only other thing is to remember to avoid that black void. It is so easy to fall into the black void, but just treat it as if you were playing any other role-playing game in the world, and the first thing that happens when they walk into the dungeon is describe the dungeon and everyone inside of it. Don't let it become a black void, because no one will find it as interesting as the Decker will, and even the Decker will just see it as a dice box.
Yeah.
So those are the three things. Just remember to don't fear the Decker. So the two things are don't fear the Decker and avoid a black void. Just those two things.
And I'll add the third thing: whenever possible, don't be afraid to use subvert infrastructure. We've brought it up many times. That thing is a godsend.
We can't bring it up enough. It's so good.
Depending on your definition of simple device, which you're allowed to change the scope of as long as you tell the players what you're doing, you can allow that matrix action to do most of the scut work. Door locks, cameras, motion detectors. As long as it's feasible to be wireless in a way they can get access to, like a host they're on, or they can reach up and touch it, or they can shoot a link arrow into it or something, then they can use it and subvert to get a long way and not like drag you and the rest of the table down while they're doing it.
Mm-hmm. My go-to shorthand for what is considered a simple device: can you use the use simple device action to use part of it, right? That's my shorthand, as if it would be considered eligible.
Yeah, and that's a good quick way to do it. I could probably think of a few examples using that logic that I'd call out of scope, but GM Fiat to each their own. But I think but it is a good way to make your player feel like they're badass, which is a huge priority for GMs, or should be, in my opinion. But we think we can carry on to the rules segment, where I'm going to mostly shut up.
Well, so what we've got is we're 2 hours into it. The presentation has about 14 more slides, and it's crunch, which can make people's eyes glaze over.
Yes.
I know that the rules, the mechanical aspects of the Matrix are one of the most daunting things, so I do not want to skip stuff, but I might touch these a little lightly. So please keep your questions rolling as they come up. If I don't touch on them before the end of this, remind me.
Do we
'Cause
want to take a 10-minute break?
We can. So tell me, because I know we're running late, tell me how much time I'm going to have for the rest of the slides so I can look through them real quick and make sure.
We're about at 2:04 now, so if we get back at 2:14, you'll have about 46 minutes. If we want
All
to
right.
stick to the 3-hour mark, and then we can answer questions after.
All right. So I'll try to aim for maybe a half an hour to let us have some more question time.
Okay, everyone, bathroom break. The stream will resume in 10 minutes.
Okay, cool. All right, see you all in 10 minutes.
Okay.
audio on?
Now it is.
Okay, we're back, people, and we're gonna throw it immediately over to Fraith here so we can get into the nitty-gritty of the rules section. You may go fast, but we'll try to pause for some sections of it. But we're trying to stick under that three-hour mark, so let's get it going. Frey.
All right. So, once upon a time, Dilmar had a really bright idea. I'm not going to read the slide at you. She was stupid, too. But basically, they bought into this idea where they were going to get something for nothing. And they hooked up this new wireless matrix that was going to be so cool and not have to use physical hardware anymore. And they got more than they bargained for. So, and apparently in 6E, they're going to fuck it up even worse for no good reason. The matrix used to have physical hosts everywhere. Now it's this disembodied magic cloud BS that we have to work with. The metaphysics of it are in Kill Code. It's a very good read. I do recommend reading through it. How valuable that is for actually doing the stuff, well, it's more important that you have coherent descriptions and mechanics that make sense. So the origin story is not so much. Let's go on to the next slide. So we want to make sure that, especially for the crunch parts, that you have a common lexicon. Targeting is important. These words, there are a lot of squares versus rectangles. An icon, everything in the matrix has an icon. A brewery might have pressure icons, pressure sensors. They might have temperature sensors. They might have how well the fermentation yield is going. Those are all icons. Those are generally going to be devices. A device is an icon. Not all icons are devices, right? A file has an icon. Complex forms have specific targeting. The way complex form targeting works is a little more open-ended than the way most matrix actions work. Please pay attention to that. Just because a complex form can do device actions at personas does not mean every matrix action can do that. Next slide. So the first thing, we talked about this briefly during Johnny's run. There are interface modes. So primarily, this is how the character is experiencing the matrix. So the first one, augmented reality, is an overlay on the real world. You're moving around in your own skin. It's like Google Glass or something similar. You're going to see a metric ton of ads everywhere. If you've ever watched Minority Report, when he's walking by the mall and it's like, oh, hello, have you thought about this suit? That is exactly what happens in AR. Most of everybody, hacker or not, are in AR to some degree. If you're focusing on AR and you're doing matrix actions in AR, you take a penalty to do things, well, non-technomancers take a penalty to do things in the real world. Unless the character is actively doing stuff, focusing on AR, don't hit them with the penalty. If they're just watching the ads or the pop-outs for who's got a good restaurant or their smart link, that's not AR enough to be distracting. If you consider it like astrally perceiving, if they're actually focusing on all the iconography and the other stuff that's going on, then you can hit them with a penalty. Okay, so that's your walking around experience. You can also leave your body. Then you get into full body SimSense, and it comes in two flavors. It comes in cold and hot. Both of them functionally paralyze your body with a narrow set of exceptions and have all of your senses be hooked to the matrix instead. So it's a full sensory, safe version of the Oasis from Ready Player One, where you can fly, you can go wherever you want. You're out in Emerald City with the huge hosts hovering above you. You can tailor your persona to look like whatever you want. Biofeedback will give you stun damage and a headache, but it generally won't kill you. Normal people can use Cold Sim all the time. The people who want the cutting edge for speed or responsiveness or addictions can take out all of the safeties and do hot sim. The corporations don't want you to do hot sim. Sensible people maybe shouldn't do hot sim unless they have to, because biofeedback damage can actually cause you to curl up and die. It is faster and more responsive. The sensations are more real. It actually can cause addictions. We do not do standard VR hot sim addiction here.
We have it covered under dependent.
Yeah, you can have it as a dependency, but we don't. I don't believe we don't force addiction checks for this. Foundation ultraviolet level stuff is different, and we'll talk about that in a moment. This is like the Oasis where you can actually be gunned down and die.
The rough difference, an easy way to think about the difference between cold sim and hot sim is cold sim is real enough. You will have some haptic feedback if you get punched. Hot sim is approaching more real. This is where better than life chips come.
Yeah, better than life chips are based on hot sim. They've got the volume turned up a little higher, and you can drink totally normal virtual coffee at cold sim. So you can, with a DNI, do all senses. And to do VR at all, you have to have some form of DNI. So trodes at a minimum. Technomancers have a bonus to matrix perception in AR. They have there is a +2 to matrix actions for everyone in hot sim. And then we get into stealth. So we talked about running silent. You basically stop talking to the matrix as loud as you can. You stop sending extra chatty Windows messages. You turn everything down as low as it can go and still experiencing it, which allows you to sneak. When you're running silent, you have a -2 to everything you do in the matrix, because you're cutting your inputs, because you're cutting your outputs, because you're limiting your interaction with the matrix. That means if you're running in hot sim and you're silent, it cancels out. Technomancers normally can't do cold sim. There is a quality that they can get that will allow them to do cold sim. If they have that quality and they opt to do hot sim, that +2 bonus to matrix actions also happens to resonance actions, and they keep the +2 to matrix actions while in cold sim, because technos cheat. So running silent is sneakery. You can do it on the general matrix. When you're running silent, it's matrix perception to find you, and it's resisted with your logic plus sleaze. If you're running a comlink silent, it doesn't have sleaze. It still gets to make the test. It just only makes it with your logic. It'll work in all 3 modes. You can't run silent in a foundation. You cannot run silent in a destination host. You should never. Well, you aren't on the matrix anymore in a resonance realm, so don't think that you can do it there.
Or a foundation.
I said you can't do it in a foundation.
Well, you're not on the matrix.
Yes, you're also not really on the matrix anymore in a foundation. Specific kinds of matrix activities require you to be in VR. Rigging to jump into the machine with a control rig requires you to be in VR. Foundations require you to be in hot sim VR. But many or most matrix actions can totally be done in AR. You can do a foundation or a host dive in AR. You can run a car in AR. You can shoot a gunnery. You can shoot the gun in a weapons mount via remote gunnery in AR.
Mm-hmm.
And because AR is not in VR, AR is sometimes safer, although you don't get some of the bonuses, and it's a little more awkward and a little more limiting. It can keep you safer from things like black ice. There are sometimes reasons to want.
Speaking of rigging, technically, if you have a control rig, you do not need another device to go into.
Absolutely true.
As
control rig is the important thing to jump in.
As the control rig has a built-in sim module. You cannot modify it to be hot sim, however.
So, next slide.
Quick point of that, actually, I'll just make a quick point there. AR overlays, and I'll throw this one by you guys real quick. Is one of the ways that you can definitely bring a taste of the Matrix to Matrix users. Every place is going to have a lot of AR overlay, and in fact, a really shitty dive bar may have an overlay that makes it look like it's a million new yen. And for anyone who's on AR, that stuff is going to show to them immediately.
An excellent example of this is actually the dual cover for No Future, if you've seen it.
Absolutely.
There's the grungy inside cover that shows the dirty world at its worst or its normal. And then there's the AR view of, hey, I'm special and look at the fireworks and isn't this cool?
Absolutely. The other one that I think about a lot is AR fashion, or hell, even interacting with people that aren't even there. And you may not even be aware that they aren't in AR if you're not paying attention. So it's a great way to blur the lines nicely.
From a GM perspective, there are a lot of places that and the Blackout Lounge is an example of this, may have a dual, like the iconography in the Matrix matches the real world, and they have holo projectors or some way to have the two interact. So you could have virtual patrons mixing with your physical patrons, and it may not be immediately obvious which is which.
Typically, that is reserved for places such as Dante's Inferno.
Usually higher end clubs.
They're known for that. Last I checked, anyway.
Yes. Host types. We talked about the first four on this. We only glossed over nested hosts. They are going into slightly more detail on these. They're more complicated. In general, Rabbit's suggestions are totally valid. Like everything, start simple. Don't bring the complicated things in unless you have to. Like all hosts, you cannot see into a host that you aren't inside. So if you're in host A and host A contains host B, you can't see inside host B. That means a spider in host A can't see what's going on in host B, and a spider in host B can't see what's going on in host A. There are some security problems with doing your shit like this. So keep in mind that by separating it out, you're also separating out and making it so you have to have double the staff or double the problems. It can make for interesting runs. We've had some runs where physical security is on a host and matrix security is on a different host, and high threat response is on a third host, and maybe you have 3 hackers actually controlling all 3 of those to make sure all of the pieces go well, because they're all separate hosts and you can't do all 3 at the same time. But again, simplicity is your friend. Now we get into the non-standard hosts.
I'll make a quick point there of, once again, guys, I know you're going to get excited about running these, like a nested host with an industry host on the inside that's full of AI and technocritters. Calm down, get your industry host knowledge down first, get your basics down first before you look at any of this
Not
stuff.
industry.
Yeah. Sorry about that, Brave. There you go if you're live.
It's no problem. I fell off the push to talk anyway. So we have some non-standard hosts now. We talked about how the wireless world is wireless and everything's wireless. Well, there's some legacy stuff. So outdated hosts are the Matrix 2.0 hosts that are still around. They have actual physical hardware. They ran for at least 10 years. Their mechanical differences are largely in stats, that they're actually physical, and that the convergence is slightly different. It's a higher convergence because God is busy with things that have actually gotten modern.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, they only watch it because of contractual obligation.
And we touched on that before. Remember that even good security, if they're human, they don't really necessarily want to be there. They might be underpaid and overworked. So this is a case where even God gets the underpaid, overworked, and they're only paying attention to it because they're forced.
So now, touching back on Aga's question from a while ago, for our matrix hosts, physical offline hosts and outdated hosts are physical server structure. Modern hosts are not. They are completely cloud-based.
Yeah, and from an interesting world mechanical view, files aren't stored on things usually, unless you use the cloudless
Or
program,
use
for
data
example.
chips.
Yeah, well, unless you use the cloudless program where you're actually going to download it into a chip or onto a device, or you're a technomancer and you do that because you can't store things in your own brain.
Using cloudless is how you would download it onto a device that's not a data.
Right. So, like I was saying, unless you use cloudless, it's stored out in the magic cloud somewhere associated with your persona, and it's moderately safe. But if you don't want it on the matrix, you have to use a special program to store it on something. People don't store things on things anymore, except on these outdated and offline hosts. The last part, well, the offline hosts are the even older wired matrix stuff that's still around. They have physical hosts and they're not wireless. You have to find the facility or find something cabled to it to plug into it. These can be good GM tools where you can force them to have to enter your spider's lair and stuff. But remember that these things are like obsolete. Nobody wants to run them. They're expensive. They suck. So while the security posture may be appealing, nobody running a cutting edge Black Ops thing is going to leap to do an offline Matrix 1.0 stuff. They don't want to do it. And they have no backing from God. So while you can do it, you should try to do it sparingly or have it be like leftover nuclear missile bunker somewhere in the outback of the UCAS. Or a facility, pre-crash facility that still has its stuff turned on.
Speaking of pre-crash facility, technically certain offline hosts should not be offline. Because at the tail end, before the second crash, there were several places with wireless matrix because that was the hot shit. Places like the Renrock Ecology in Seattle had localized. So technically, in say the inner workings of the AIC, you might be able to wirelessly connect to the offline devices if you had the right adapter.
Feel free to have them be described as running obsolete code and everything else. But all of these things can be talked to, worked with modern matrix commands and stuff. The obsoleteness is reflected in their stats being junk. Rogue hosts can either be a foundation host, like the 4 standard ones, or not. A rogue host could be outdated or offline. They never ever have God support. They're a wide variety of reasons. They could be a tribe's special host that they grew themselves. They could be a foundling host that was out in the dark matrix somewhere. They could be a lost AI haven. They could be a bunch of stuff. They could be paranoid survivalist types that ran their own host. Rogue hosts are very flexible. You may also wish to use them sparingly, but they work very well for things that aren't corporate culture mainstream. Now, one of the questions came up on where do hosts come from? How do you get a host? A lot of it's going to be GM fiat, frankly, and Anthony's done an excellent job of running a run to create a host. So we have some precedent, but we shouldn't take that as gospel. Basically, every foundation that starts with a rating of 1 for a rating 1 host, there's a foundation action that can grow your host. The way corporations do this is somebody got a host from somewhere, and then they send teams of hackers in to do this grow host action to make it stronger and stronger and stronger until it's got a high enough rating for them to do whatever it is they want to it. So they literally grow these things up.
As mentioned in, I believe, Data Trails, there are entire corporations devoted to growing hosts to sell to people.
Now, because foundation runs are incredibly dangerous, and the stronger the host, the more likely it is to eat the people trying to grow it, that's where the cost comes in. Because there's no physical hardware, it's not like you can say spend 1 million new yen, you get a rating 4 host or whatever. So a lot of this is very hand wave. If you need your creation to have a host, there's plenty of hosts. there's a bottomless supply of hosts because the foundation of the matrix is woo-woo.
Yes, there is one foundation per.
There's one foundation per outer host, and I only say that because if you have stacked host, if you have nested hosts, the foundation is the one on the outside. For destination host as your outermost host, it would be a rating 4 foundation. Even if there's a rating 8 host tucked into it, its foundation is only rating 4. The foundation and the outermost host align. They're the same rating. Next slide. Next one.
I think there's a little
There
bit
we
of
go. Okay.
yeah, there's a little bit of delay between the stream and us.
No, it's cool. So go back one. Pans and WANs. So PANs are personal area networks. What you're carrying on you. When you're describing people's networks, you see their persona. Their PAN is collapsed down into the persona. With matrix perception, you can dig into that and see, what music files do you have? What devices are actually slaved to your PAN, or like your guns or your augments or things like that. The maximum number of devices is directly based on the device rating. So it's device rating times 3. If you've got a really good comlink, you can have tons of slaves. If you don't have a good comlink, you can't. You cannot have chains. Please do not master a slave that's a master to something else. It won't work like that. Your persona can be on a single device that's somewhere in that relationship. It does not have to be on the master. There are downsides to not having it on the master, and usually it's only technomancers that sweat that, but there are reasons to do. In a wide area network, a WAN, your master is going to be a host. Any kind of host. It doesn't matter what flavor of host it is. Classically, corporations may slave their vehicles to a host. So the vehicle is on a WAN. Now, again, because of the nature of master-slave relationships, you get to benefit from the defenses of your master unless somebody directly connects you or your master is an industry host. But that also means you can mark and exploit the host by getting the slave. So there are reasons to not have all your things slaved and not have it all on the WAN. Defenders can subscribe to their WAN. So if you've got a defender on a shitty deck, they could actually use the host as a master and get boosts for their defenses. Data processing is the abstract for how well the device moves bits. There isn't like a real world cognate for it, like CPU cycle or something. The number is arbitrary and abstract. A bigger number means it does more stuff, but there's not like, oh my god, I've got too many devices, my stuff is crumbling. Although in setting, that's a true thing. There's no mechanical way to express it. Next slide. So when we're talking about noise, we mentioned this before. We gave some of the easy ones. A lot of them stack, right? But within a specific category, like distance, the worst one wins. So for distance, if you put a SATCOM on it and you're not above low Earth orbit, your maximum is 5. You can only get 5 noise from distance on a SATCOM. If you're not on a SATCOM, you could conceivably get more noise than that. But your environment also goes into this. If you think about it like background count, the spam or static zone is a lot like background count. It's either too much signal, like ads or flash mob or something else, or too little signal, which is the static zones, like you're out in the middle of the barrens somewhere and there just aren't any towers because some gang blew them all up. So it's background count that caps at 6 that you can never get a benefit out of. Weather usually comes down to water, although you can have exotic climates where weather could be throwing metal lace sand around or something like that. But weather and landscape also apply. You can have metal-laced walls, active jamming, anti-wireless paint, and don't forget that where the attacker is standing might be perfect. You might be standing on top of a hill with no weather, nothing else, but the other end could be underwater or something, and it both ends count.
I'm sure, Rabbit, you've got some fantastic examples or little bits to toss in here
About noise, about weather noise,
about landscaping and noise.
landscaping and noise. Well, we covered landscaping and noise a little bit ago. The IR paint, the noise generating wallpapers are a fun thing to play with to make your hackers' lives more difficult. Large amounts of trees, just large amounts of things going, through ground. If you're trying to hack into like a bunker that's buried under a hill or something, that can generate noise. I haven't done a ton of it, honestly, but I'm sure that there are a lot of very creative ways that you could generate noise using the landscape.
Well, and a lot of Rabid's noise may fall under enemy action. So there are resonance actions, there are spells, and there are potentially technocritter things that could be upping your noise too. As a GM, you should keep in mind, the players are going to claim that I've got plenty of noise reduction. And they might be right, except they're probably also running smoke and mirrors, which is going to cut into their noise reduction. And, maybe they'll be on the move, or maybe somebody will actually try to jam them, and they'll be cut off because Omega Dawn is coming for them. So be aware that you can totally use it. They'll think they've got it, but maybe they left their magic pants at home.
Yeah, and remember the difference between noise reduction for stuff that affects distance and noise reduction for stuff that affects all noise reduction. So they might have enough of one type, but not enough of the other. Magic pants, for instance.
Potentially, yeah. The other thing with magic pants is that, remember, it's directional. So if it's not a place they can point, it may not help. Try not to just take away their stuff but do keep it sane, because that's part of the limitation of the device. Antennas are always good, but they can only get through them. All right, next slide. Go ahead to the next one. We're going to get into some of the deeper stuff that we've talked about before.
Do we want to do pause for questions, or do we want to power through?
19 minutes until we hit the 3-hour mark.
Okay. I'd like to power through because we've got some questions, and some of them might get answered in this.
Gotcha.
So, some interchangeable vocabulary. We've got spiders in the host. We've got spiders that are running physical security. That can be like sensors and cameras. We talked about host architecture and sculpting, where I'm mimicking my building. You can do things like have the guards actually show up in the host, so that the decker can watch where the pockets of guards are. You can also have your traps and alarms in there. If they bring their decker in AR, it might be easier to have them make matrix perception checks and stuff like that. And some of these things can run off-site. So if it's not physically in the building but has an alarm wire that goes somewhere else, that's still a thing that can happen, or it might send a wireless trigger to someone else. Things like watchdog marks and snooping can be used for that. Next slide. One of Rabbit's favorites is to not just have a patrol, but to also have bloodhound, because if they get on you, they go after different things and they layer very well. My recommendation to GMs is not to get too attached to your unloaded ice for your ice tray, because usually if they trigger an alarm and it starts to load ice, the hacker's going to booger off. He's going to run away. The slide has a lot of the standard tricks that I've seen come up. From a GM's perspective, you have to be aware that these are things that get used a lot. You can suggest them if it's a situation that warrants it. But this falls under the earlier slide of making them feel like elite hacksaws. if they're watching the guards' communications because they hack the comms network and they can insert commands to redirect them places and use their leadership to send the guards the wrong place, they're going to feel pretty happy about themselves. If you planned for biomonitors and their legwork revealed that there are biomonitors, then they can be like, oh, and now I can GIGO a biomonitor so that it will report everything's fine when we kill them dead or knock them out or whatever. From an opposition standpoint, you can use the team's biomonitors against them. If the hacker on the team isn't keeping the opposition hacker busy, he could use the biomonitor to trigger their auto injectors or do other evil stuff to them. So, you can look through these and ask questions on it. One of my favorite things to do is to turn a hacking challenge into social engineering. If the spider is suspicious and comes over and starts asking questions, you can provoke a conversation and make them use skills they were not expecting to use rather than brute force or marking it or data spiking stuff. They might have to draw on their face to be like Cyrano and tell them how to date the guard.
Mm-hmm. I will say that please do this, GMs. There is nothing better than watching an awkward. Because let's be real, calling you all you deckers out, you're all nerds. And it's nothing better than to watch an awkward nerd who thought he was going to be doing a ton of Matrix actions suddenly get stuck in the middle of pleasant discussion, corp speak discussions, and also trying to get away to do what he needs to do. It's great. Use it often.
And it also is good for those times like I think Flamehead or somebody, well, I know somebody was asking questions about blending in. If you adjust your persona to look like you're a good corporate drone in the corporate host and you're being a great drone and you're a technomancer, so you're keeping your OS clean and you're layering in your legal matrix actions so that it's not obvious you're being illegal, well, maybe somebody will come over to talk about the latest episode of Miracle Shooter Unplugged or something. They come over for coffee talk, and now you've got to socially interact with people who'd be like, well, that's our number one sponsored show. We watch it every day at mandatory lunchtime. What do you mean you didn't see the episode?
This can be doubly affected by, well, let me make sure that I'm saying this right. Masquerade, the complex form.
Masquerade is incredibly hard to pull off, but very rewarding when you do it.
Yes. So there's always that option as well for people who are interested in getting into Matrix social stuff. And GMs, if they want to try, let them try, right?
Masquerade is super fun. It's also a matrix action, not a complex form, so deckers can do it too.
Yes.
Shit.
Just a reminder that Masquerade requires the target and the person you're pretending to be both be online. So, like if your rest of your party keeps the guy busy so he's not talking to anybody, then you can digitally body snatch him and present him to other. Next slide. So, rewarding the players for clever ideas is some of the things on this. If they're doing their legwork right, or during the job, giving them like the equivalent of audio logs can deepen the immersion. This isn't strictly rules, really, but it is one of those things where cute. I just lost access to the slide deck. It is one of those things where if they think to ask the questions and they're going off script and they're like, well, God, what does Project Audacious Thunder actually do? You can make up something to give them insight into your cunningly crafted adventure that is rewarding to both of you. You get to show off your work and they get to feel like they ferreted out something they were not going to find unless they've gotten super smart.
Mm-hmm.
You never have to reveal that you totally wanted them to find that.
Once again, it comes back to that same line of just don't fear the decker. The more they get creative, the more you should reward their creative activities. There are, of course, limits. Don't let people hack Zero Orbital, right? But if they want to get creative and interesting, let them be, because they can't blow up the universe by doing so. And all they can really do is force multiply for their team.
On the structure of pay data, do remember that you've got an RVP budget. If you set the initial payouts a little lower than your full budget, then you can give them Easter eggs if they're really cool that you've got slack for. Versus if you give them an upfront payment that uses up all your budget, now you can't really. You have to start talking to Anfiers to get permission to go high or justify your stuff rather than having it be organic and, oh, look, you actually found the file that could totally blackmail somebody. You can sell that for an extra couple thousand. And then your party thanks, the party's going to thank the hacker for finding the cool stuff that gives them more cash. So some topics on security in general. I like to do this all as prep for legwork. Different GM styles will vary. If you have this information planned out, how many people are on duty, what are their rules, then you're prepared in advance for when they do something weird. Instead of having to make a snap judgment on, oh God, is that enough to call in HDR? If you've already said HDR happens when 2 or more guards die, and the party takes precautions to make sure nobody knows they're actually dead, like hacking biomonitors, you now know that the trigger didn't get hit.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Anthony.
I was going to say, at this point, one thing I like to mention to people is if you, as a GM, are not comfortable to do something, specifically in response to, let's say you're on a host and your decker is getting a little too creative and asks if he can go into the Foundation or asks if you can do this, that, or the other, and you're not prepared to run that, just tell the player. Like, just outright tell the player that I can't run a Foundation run and I'm not comfortable in doing that. So the answer, unfortunately, is no. Don't. While it's great to be able to improvise, sometimes you need to know your own limits, basically.
Yeah, and honestly, although some people are like, I'm really comfortable with the Foundation, Foundations murder people dead, so don't be afraid to just. Likewise, if you plan who's actually going to show up for HDR, is it a layered response or is it going to cut straight to the chase and you're going to have an Ares PR6 maximum firepower team or what? Because the high threat response label means a lot of things to a lot of people. If you sketch out what you mean as levels of escalation advance and how you get from one level to the next, like if they body snatch a corporate executive who just happens to be there and put him under threat, I bet the big dogs are going to show up quicker than if they just somebody finds a dead janitorial person lying in a hallway. And I guess the last aspect of this, and some of this is we can probably talk about outline. The NPC stat blocks that we've got online as GM resources or that you can find in the books, they will never hold a candle to shadowNET PCs. There's almost no instance where out of the box they are meaningful adversaries against experienced characters. When you're adjusting the stat blocks, because it is a thing you will need to do at times, always go towards the recommendations in a limited way. Do not make these guys inexplicably holy shit good at everything. Every run should have a strong point that the players will want to avoid and weaker points that they will want to find out about through legwork and exploit so they don't get their heads stove in. Don't be the team that goes up against the martial arts masters with nothing but knives. Be the team that finds out that there are martial arts masters with knives and shoots them from a long way down a hall. Don't be us. As GMs, make sure you design weak points that can be found through some combination of legwork, sense, matrix searches, something else, so that they can find it and then plan a countermeasure and think they're really cool because they defeated your challenge. Because your job's not to win, your job's to tell a cool story. In my opinion, I guess there's plenty of room to discuss that. Next slide. So we've got GM guidelines for how high the dice pool should get. If you've got a super soldier crew that are all collectively ruiner, plus they've got guns. Please, for God's sake, set the threshold, the threat level high enough, and have a narrative reason why they're such badasses. Don't be like, the dragon can't be touched by anything. Be like, the dragon's limbs are all ruby crystals. You have no idea why this thing is so damn hard, but most of it's translucent crystal, and that's not right. So that there's some reason that they can be like, well, that was about 4,000 times worse than a normal dragon, and normal dragons are badass.
I feel called out.
Yeah, you kind of are. In our advanced scenario, how to murder people with diseases, Bio will be sharing that one.
There were no diseases present, but yes, I will.
No, that was other runs. So anyway, your goal is to keep fairness. By plotting some of these things out, you don't run the risk of a snap decision railroading people into a brick wall of pain and death. You do preserve the ability to remind them that they're being unwise, or that they should have their hacker actually do something about the camera footage. But if they insist on ignoring prompts or deliberately choosing things because they're sure they can handle it, you have a fair way to crush them with their choices if that's the way the script is running. Do not aim to crush anybody with your script. But, fair, tough love, I think, is where I'm aiming on that. On hosts, and this is again a numbers thing, with a non-industry host, remember that you get up to almost double your host, and that the attacker has to get a success on a ton of checks if they have to do dice rolls on everything. So you want them to not have to have, well, I don't know, getting a file can result in at least 4 checks. So if they have less than 4 edge, you maybe shouldn't have something that's just as tough as their dice pool if you're planning it out in advance. Unless you want it to be hard as shit or want them to have to plan a way to get around that by a direct connection or something else. You want to measure the dice pool in such a way that it is not a 50-50 shot, because their chances of failure go way the hell up from that, just from randomness coming to get them. Or if you're on Rabbit's table where you're just going to fail.
I will quickly mention to people the thing that, and this comes back to just talk to your players. It's hard to tell someone's character's abilities based on their character sheet alone. They're going to have tricks that aren't on the character sheet that you don't know. One thing worth saying to your players, if you have statted up this stat block for a host that you think is totally adequate, and it either turns out to be they walk all over it or they get their butts beaten in by it, right? Feel free to tell the player that, look, I think that I've set my host rating too high or too low. I'm going to change it now, and all the stats are going to change accordingly. I apologize for that. I didn't realize the exact statistics of the character I'm dealing with. Be willing to say that, because otherwise, like to make things easier, or just leave it as and let people run with it.
Yeah, although, I would tend to aim to the leave it alone if it's too weak narratively somewhere else, like the physical intrusion team. If it's too tough and it's going to crush them and they're going to fail because they have no matrix overwatch, think about ways to adjust it. Or ways to prompt them into change your approach and come at it a different way. So,
I agree.
If they mechanically have an on their sheet dice pool of 14, they can probably handle a rating 7 host, but it's probably going to be tougher than you think. If you want it to be a rating 8 host, they're going to have to bring tactics into it. If you're going to make it higher than a rating 8 host, they're going to have trouble with it. If it's an industry host, cut that number by a lot, because every single check they do on almost every approach is going to have many more dice.
Yep, and be aware that the law of averages will eventually catch up with deckers. Just because of the sheer number of dice they have to roll, even on the most basic of runs.
So let's see. We should probably have a dollar jar for every time we mention subvert infrastructure. Use it, encourage it. It will simplify your life. Most of the things that runner teams actually want to do can probably be done for subversion unless it's a data steal. Do remember that subversion will be attacking the host. and that subversion affects things inside the host from outside. So even though you don't have to go in the host to subvert stuff, they will take subversion attempts more seriously. So unlike the standard, oh, you were banging on the outside of the host and nobody came to look because that just happens, if you subvert and you fail, there can be consequences. So don't scale your hosts up so high that they can't subvert, because they see the big numbers, they won't even try. And now you're going to have to deal with every single goddamn hack. Make it, if you want them to subvert, make it look like they can succeed at subverting. And the last thing on this is to change up the script. We talked about make it a social encounter, have a redirect in progress that shows that you thought you were going for X. Once you're in there, you find out it's actually Y. Your data file is in the archive, so now you have to actually go bag a thumb drive or find a guy with an archive key. But when you throw a twist in there, be aware of how that's going to impact your time budget. If you planned a 4-hour run, but there was a major twist in the middle of it, it may take a part 2. So assess your redirects and your surprises and your environment changes against your time budget, or you'll be kind of unpleasantly surprised when it comes up. Let's take a look at the next one.
Next slide.
It takes
So-
a second.
Yeah, so the world is, your events don't happen in a vacuum. You could have other people in the same host attacking. You could have people altering your altered files. You could have 2 teams competing for the same objective. Like before, be careful when you put these twists in, because they can dramatically alter chances for success without a lot of forecasting and leave bad vibes. They can also make things really exciting. If for example somebody was hacking an Evo host while you were in there to get a prototype, and they were fucking around with the employee records while you're trying to insert your team's records so they can go be a janitor crew, they might catch the other guy while you're in there, and ice might start deploying, and the decker could think they're boned, but it's actually the other guy. So you could show him what it looks like to get caught by crushing an enemy decker right in front of him, and maybe scare the pants off him at the same time. Although, honestly, he'll probably run. Next slide. Next one, we're going to talk about AI. So, shorthand for AI, Catalyst, why did you do this to us? The easiest way to handle them is treat them like sprites with weird programs. In our advanced matrix, we will talk about how to deal with the intricacies of AI. The important things are on this slide. They look really weird. They can be straightforward if you have them in a device. If you don't have them free floating through the matrix trying to emulate, their mechanics are okay. If you treat them like sprites, non-resonant sprites that have special abilities in their advanced programs and their program choices, it'll be safe to handle them without dramatic rules fuck-ups. Crash program actually immobilizes them for a little while, where they can be put into AI prisons. We don't have any AI PCs. That may change, especially next rule cycle. And as we move into possible custom content. Say again?
This is no promise for anything. Don't get your hopes up.
Yeah, that's true. That it may change, but for NPC AI, treating them like sprites or spirits with their depth number telling you roughly how powerful they are is a way to handle them if you want to have AI in your adventure. They come in 3 main flavors. You have proto-sapients. They are akin to animals. They are drawn to the acacia vine wrapped wild hosts and defend them. They're calm while they're there, but they defend the host. And they prevent ice from deploying in those wild wrapped hosts. There are xenosapients, which are alien AI. They're incredibly hard to communicate with. It's really hard to get a common frame of reference. What they want, what they're trying to accomplish, how you can get them to go accomplish it somewhere the hell else or stop eating you. Those are all hard things with Xenosapiens.
Mhm.
And
They call out that you can't just pull out a keyboard and play a song and wait for them to respond. They call that out in the text.
yeah, I like the more recent one where with the common language involved time travel. They're weird. And then there are metasapiens, which are the closest to metahumanity. And the metasapien AI, they often awaken, emerge. They often become sapient out of things like taxis or cars or toasters. Out of something that's part of metahuman life that was a computing device. Sometimes you'll get an AI out of it. And sometimes they like to continue doing what they used to be doing.
Proto-sapiens and Xenosapiens are the closest, are the most common to just do what they did. And it's emerged, yeah, for the nomenclature.
Yeah, the hard part with that is
Or
emerged
text.
is also becoming resonant. So
They're not the emerged, but they do emerge.
yeah, you'll see emerged used for them. I think I've used blossom to keep it from making it sound like the resonant or awakened.
Oh yeah, and
Not non-magical, non.
And null sector type of Xenosapien AI, even though sometimes we like to categorize.
Very true. Nullsect are Xeno AIs, even though they hate human-based AIs. Which also, as an aside, not all AIs were forged by the hand of man. Some of them are out in the Matrix with no apparent origin. Nobody knows where they came from or what the hell they're doing. Next slide.
Yeah, and if the sentence AIs can sometimes form on their own out in the wild, resonance doesn't get your creative juices flowing. I don't know what does.
Avoid concepts like wild resonance. That's a scary one.
Oh, there is actually a fourth category of AI. I forgot. Introduced in Kill Code, it's the Technosapiens, which are things like your sin eaters, your glitches, your noise storms.
Yes.
More natural phenomena that.
Yeah, and there's cyber wolves and the weirder things are generally proto-sapien AIs, I think.
Those might be, but Technosapien is definitely different.
Yeah. So Spio does love plants and rocks, but also all the techno critters. So we mentioned this before. You can tweak them. They use intuition instead of logic for things. They defend with intuition instead of logic for things. Yeah, thinking about them as animals, like normal animals that happen to be in the Matrix, is cool. Generally, giving them animal-like motivations probably okay. If they're not hive-minded, don't let them use like real tactics. They can hunt as packs, but don't give them real good tactics unless they're hive-minding and they get smart. And they can't submerge. Don't give them echoes. They don't do complex forms. They have some specific resonance powers.
That being said, technically, using the most bare definition technically, theoretically, a sapient, mundane creature can emerge as a technomancer and not a technocritter, which would allow them to do all.
Let's save that for the homebrew and the really advanced stuff, though.
Yes, that should be for the advanced stuff and more specifics, but it is.
Mm-hmm. I assume the standard thing is talk to law first, right, Spear?
It falls under all the rest of the advanced GM things, which can be found in GM.
Okay.
It's generally things like this are going to be advanced GM territory and not come up much. If you're ever curious, you can definitely ask Anfiers, and they'll give their input. And lore team will absolutely give input and or retcon things if you get too wild. Next slide. So we mentioned saltwater kills signal, and even freshwater kills signals, yet there's a lot of emerged critters underwater. Feel free to use pseudoscience like lasers, sonar, other data-bearing EM phenomenon, and physical waves that work, that aren't human tech, but do work so that your techno critters underwater can talk to each other. Because those techno whales are talking to somebody. So, Yeah, they also can't compile sprites. Several of them can eat sprites. Many AI can totally eat sprites. Don't be afraid to have free sprite or something else eaten to illustrate your Xenosapiens' destructive power before it turns on the party.
Some techno critters / most, if not all, can also live off of resonance or eating icon.
Which is kind of weird when the physical cat gets fat by eating all the ads near your apartment.
They cannot drain a resonance attribute, but they could subsist off of living near it.
I just had an image of a fat techno kitty and I love it. Um, yeah, one of that's one of the most best ways to actually just make someone immediately panic when they see another AI is just be like, oh, and then they just nom on a sprite or a piece of data right in front of them because people think they know what's going on in the Matrix, and when they see something like that for the first time, they go, "What? They can do that?"
As we've mentioned, their stats aren't generally a significant statistical threat to players. They can be buffed. They can also totally affect players' gear or be an environmental hazard. E-hives are horrible. And because AR is very prevalent, as we mentioned, a lot of people are interacting with AR all the time. Holographic concealment and sneaking up on you is totally a thing. They might be hiding behind stuff that you can't see unless you're turned on, but everybody's always turned on. Inadvertent lewd, wording check. Yes. Next slide.
And didn't get mentioned there, but if there is no mundane stats for critter, you can get the mundane stats by removing the resonance from a techno critter.
Yeah, and I guess the rules team will be looking at that for more mundane critter options for all you pet herders out there, because that's like a by the book way to get more mundane mundane things for use with shape change or critter form or whatever else you want to do with it. Is take a resonant thing like a recon. Well, no, those are biodrones, but take a resonant critter, just strip the resonant stuff off of them.
Rooks are the bird.
Rooks, yeah.
It does make a weird thing of how you could have a bastet that is you could take this data of the rook and have, but yeah.
So many of these things have been specific powers and how to use or abuse them. These last two, so spraying is kind of fun. Marking your territory, your digital territory, so you come into somebody's industry host and the whole thing has been claimed by a techno skunk or a pride of bastard or something. Yeah, that could be spooky. And venomous code is mind damaging to think about. So, yeah.
It's a computer virus which damages your persona with cyber combat, but you resist it with your body plus willpower plus normal toxin resistance modifiers.
So your nephritic screens can totally protect your persona.
But you aren't affected, your devices. Presumably this is meant to kill other techno critters, but still.
So anyway, that's been a walkthrough on some of this. Now let's see. We're going to touch some of these specific questions we had and make sure we actually covered them. So Dark Wolf in the way back. I got a Technomancer to table pull up a level fuck you sprite. How do you present a threat without fudging dice? Well, so one, the sprite may be like, oh my god, force of nature, but the sprite herder isn't. So Rabbit has been quite successful in killing pet sprites, and will continue that trend, I'm sure, because Belfrith is bottomless.
Yes.
But,
only two so far, but
so
we're hopeful for the future.
The real one of the ways to handle it is that a monster sprite showing up in your host may be one of those predefined HTR callouts. Maybe they're going to get an on-call spider or a big dog to fight, like the only Technomancer they've got on call to bring his own big dog sprite in and fight your sprite and tie your sprite up. The Technomancer can continue to do whatever they're going to do, but maybe you're going to have some sprite on sprite violence, because if your players are strong enough to pull that kind of sprite in, so's the opposition. It may take them a little bit. The other thing is to know sprites' limits. So if you've got, say, a level 14 crack sprite, it's an astoundingly good hacker. But it can't disable data bombs, and data bombs can actually kill a level 14 sprite.
Which we learned very recently.
Data sprites can kill data bombs can kill whatever the fuck they want.
As a reminder, it's rating number of D6s in damage. It escalates.
Yes, but yeah, but both Progress and Dark Wolf have learned this very recently.
Well, my sprite survived at least.
Yeah, true.
And they're they don't get better from that. I mean, they can heal, but if you one shot a pet sprite, it's just fucking gone. So the easiest way to handle it is to, depending on the kind of sprite, is to either give the sprite lots of targets or call for the big dogs. Be like, I don't know what to do with it. It's bigger than my house. I can't handle this. I'm going to call for help. You could technically burn for your sprite. And Fears asks, sprites are player resources. That means you can spend your resources on them. You can spend edge for them, which means you can burn edge for them. That may actually come up on Progress since he can't replace his anymore. So, moving on. Let's see. Did that answer your question, Dark Wolf, or do you got Leo?
I think LAQ is still in chat.
Well, he might not be on chat. Okay, so
Playing
moving
World
on
of
to
Warcraft, it looks like.
Okay.
moving on to Aga's questions here. So we talked about creating a host. We talked about sculpting not being completely cosmetic, but also being real. It does not really affect Matrix line of sight. It can psychologically affect a ton of stuff.
Yeah, I'll put it to you this way. It's so surprising how often, if you put them into an actual room and say that something is downstairs, that they will say their characters will move downstairs, despite the fact they don't have to.
Yeah, and treating them like real spaces is good because you could easily have an escalation condition be if somebody ignores the sculpting. If they insist on being super anarchy man or living fire in the shape of a person when they're in a corporate host, they're drawing attention. If they decide to walk through the walls, come get them.
Yeah, that comes up a lot when you don't do the run silent thing, when you're posing as a legitimate user, which is something Technos can do really easily as well. But yeah, if you don't, because normal wage slaves are going to obey the sculpting, because they do. It's just psychological. You see a table in front of you, you're not going to walk through it.
So, Agus 4, how do you tactic the Matrix beyond mechanics? Well, so I'll give you some examples of things I've done as a technomancer that use hiding in plain sight. I have in the past researched a facility, found out who are their super users. There are these 4 guys, and then I find the files that have their IDs, and I take one of their names out, and I put my name in, and I come back to the place later to do my work, and I'm them. Maybe I'm not really them, but as far as the ICE is concerned, I'm on the super user list, and I can just hang out, not running silent, and do my shit. And one of the other deckers, when the other site spiders come over and ask, I can be like, oh yeah, I'm a troubleshooter from corporate, and my tactic is to actually face them in the Matrix and go after the people, not the ICE. So by research and approach, you can change what you have to deal with. Technomancers are fabulous at this because, there's a file in archives. Well, you find the guy with the archive key with a combination of matrix search and matrix perception, and then you puppeteer him to copy the key to you, and now you've got the archive key. Go pull it out of archives. Yeah, or if your GM is willing, go down into the foundation and find it that way.
Yeah. Puppeteer is one of those insanely useful complex forms that breaks a lot of security protocols that we actually haven't talked about at all so far.
Yeah, and one of the important things, Puppeteer works on personas and devices.
Not
but
hosts.
it doesn't work on hosts, and it does not work on files, because files are not personas or devices. So you cannot puppeteer a file to get in your pocket, nor can you puppeteer a file to give you marks.
But you can puppeteer you can puppeteer people and puppeteer devices to give you marks though, which is a huge thing, especially if your techno didn't need to invest in hacking because they can just make most of the things they need.
Massive time saver, works really well with direct connection, is surprisingly easy to resist by an actual person or real stats, but works great on default device rating 2.
Yeah, Puppeteer plus SkinLink will get you far.
There are other examples of tactics, but most of what I consider matrix tactics is preparing the battlefield and waiting it so that you've got the advantage. I've also seen things like doing preparatory warfare, particularly as the techno. You go in silent, you stay silent, you mark the shit out of stuff, so that if you need a mark, you've got a mark. You make sure you mark the spiders, you mark the surroundings, you get your cameras up front, you clean yourself off regularly. Then when the fight actually happens, you're the submarine and you just get to start nuking stuff. And you play submarine warfare.
Submarine warfare is very popular and very effective. The other fun tactic that I like to have a lot of fun with my decker with my wireless decker, with my older decker, is flicker decking, where you basically use your free actions on either end of your turn to take smoke and mirrors on and off, so you don't have it on when you're acting. And you don't have to worry about the noise penalty, but you have it on when they're acting. It's very useful. Just takes up some action economy, which does bite you in the ass occasionally, but it can be a very good tactic.
And as a GM, if you notice people doing that and leaning on it, you could actually do things like held action. When he moves to attack, I light him up, and then you get him without his sleeves up or whatever.
Yep.
Get him while his firewall's down. So let's see. That was tactics. Is there a technical device that isn't matrix compatible? Yes. So throwbacks are all not wireless matrix compatible. For sheer logistics reasons, it is fucking madness to have physically disconnected locks and stuff in your building as a rule. It's very inconvenient. When they break, it's a pain in the ass. They lock your people in. Putting your locks on a different host, putting your locks on a different service, having your locks connected by wire are all far more likely than having throwback locks. But they can happen.
Yeah, hardwired matrix security is the thing.
That last one is technically throwback.
Okay. They also have drone rails and some newer things that aren't throwback, but do give you the function of they're not wireless.
Well, same difference.
Yeah, well, it comes back to the concept of a hardwired security setup where you have just a bunch of devices that are all wired to each other, and they're controlled physically from another device. So you can still hack them if you can plug yourself into them, but they aren't accessible from, across the ocean with a sat link sort of thing.
Yeah, it only means that you have to establish a direct connection. A cable or a touch link or some other direct access. They all work on matrix protocols because that's everything does. So if for example, well, let's see. So here's a real world example. I am a street samurai. I am terrified of someone taking over all my augments. I have an internal router. I get to use my wireless functions without being wireless on, right? So I'm not wireless. That means you have to come up to me and plug into my data jack or plug into my arm or skin link me or something, or you can't screw with my stuff.
The only other thing I'll mention on that
real
front.
world.
my only other thing I'd mention about that is that ever since the CRP, they have been trying to drill it into us that you would have to be insanely paranoid to ever consider a non-wireless option for security.
Which is horseshit.
Yeah, they've said that since the beginning of the CRB, and they've pretty much carried that on for the entire time. So
we're going to play pretend, and as GMs, we will acknowledge that the culture says that the security trade-offs for going wireless are far outweighed by all of the really cool stuff that nobody ever actually gets around to mentioning that makes the wireless matrix real. So it's an option. You should reserve it for special cases where they really are that paranoid for absolute reasons, and try not to use it if you don't have to. Or if it's thematically sensible, Or it's a Matrix 1.0, they were wireless, so of course it's wired, or they were wired, so of course it's wired. Okay, but try not to pull that out just to mess with hackers, because there are actually still countermeasures, but you don't want to be punitive. When Omega Dawn came for Progress, he really desperately wished they'd been stupid enough to leave their equipment turned on, but they totally didn't. So it didn't go as well as it could have until he ran up to one and touched their grenade.
Almost.
And that's not even.
Almost
That's
like
not
they.
even.
Almost like they hunt Shadowrunners on the weekends or something.
But that isn't even a part of being super paranoid or whatever. Run and gun has part of its small unit tactics. It's still a valid tactic and used commonly for units to go completely offline whenever.
Yeah, but I mean it's different to have your unit go offline and have your whole building go offline.
Well,
I
You were bringing up a unit.
that's true. I did muddy my own waters. Okay, so
Yeah, I got basically for Fifth World Tech, you theoretically could still hack it, but it doesn't run on the same thing, so you need a way to.
GM Fiat, whether that works, because
GM Fiat and software test to write a driver. Probably.
And you'd also need a way to plug into it because Universal Data Connector is not universal to things that use different ports.
yep. So the universal data ports were not a thing until the Sixth World. So.
And even then, they still use whatever computers use for their stuff in Shadowrun.
Yeah.
Until we got decks and stuff.
The mental image of a Decker, like, going through the third drawer in his kitchen cupboards looking for an old connector. Like, I knew I had one floating around here somewhere.
So 7, how can Op4 proactively defend? Well, so that comes into your defining your rules of engagement and what they do. If, for example, your super users are all in a file that says super users, anyone that has 3 marks is suspicious unless they're in that file. So by defining that they've added an additional layer of headache and security by marking their authorized security people in this thing, then you have this hidden tripwire that says if you've got 3 marks on anything and you're not one of these people, you're actually an intruder. You can have things like RFID-enabled badges that mark people as there. If they fake the badge but they don't fake the RFID, then they are marked as intruders. But you need to define these all in advance, and you need to make them accessible to some level of legwork, because they have security briefing training manuals where they tell their people, make sure you check their badge for a RFID, which means now you know that there's a RFID if you hunted up their policy and procedure guide.
We can go on about a lot of very interesting security measures, Matrix and otherwise, that don't see a lot of use, that are even in the core book that have been around for a while. Like on the run I did with the airport, I had basically archways that tagged everybody with nanotag dust. And that is something I've never seen a GM use, and I had never used until that point when I remembered it existed, and I thought it'd be cool for that run. So.
And it was.
Half of it is knowing what's in the books, and half of it is being creative.
Godless grids. Okay, so maybe if you drop grid, there is a deep matrix. There's a matrix past the part that we built, that we curate, that's got all our hosts in it. So once you get around the local grids, there's the deep black that has hosts in it still, but it's not necessarily made by people. You could consider it outer space matrix full host.
The wild matrix is where all the weird stuff is.
Yeah.
As described in Kill Code and such. God is not there, but you can, and it's incredibly dangerous. But you can find anything from like melting clown acid trip to serene wilderness fist.
Or Wonderland.
Yeah.
Wonderland's not wild.
Well,
yeah. If I remember right, the NeoNet grid still exists too as part of that.
It got taken over by Spinrad.
Oh, was it actually taken over? It's not rebuilt?
Well, it's not part of the wild matrix anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, the Big Ten all get their own global grids, and Spin Global has eaten NeoNet's global.
Well, not the global grid, the Emerald City grid, the original one, because NeoNet had built that one originally, from what I recall, and then I wasn't sure if Spinrad just took that over or if they built a new one from Seattle.
It's the same one.
It's the
still
same one.
City.
It's the same grid. Okay.
The AI kingdom is out there. There's a bunch of stuff like that. There are godless hosts more than there are godless grids. The wild matrix is all godless and weird. And also an advanced thing that you should probably stay away from unless you've absolutely got to do. But you can. And I guess the last one I've got written down was from Hidden is what does a matrix search look like for like, and just like iconography, what does your persona look like is individualistic. Everybody can define what their matrix search looks like.
It's kind of a, it's kind of an interesting mash of your persona going out and checking less secure or just open hosts for information over the course of several hours or, a few minutes, depending on what level of information you're looking at.
My go-to has always been that a rating 1 search is literally matrix searching, like just essentially Googling. Rating 3 is going and finding files and searching through them, maybe looking up your local library or local hub of information. And that rating 6, depending on how deep it goes, may involve tiny little host dives that can happen off camera. But this is all purely from a fluff perspective.
Yeah.
There is no mechanical change.
A lot of the fluff I like to use for that is like leaked stuff that gets posted on shadow boards.
I've always assumed that part of the rating 6 stuff is like actual info trading with like other deckers who might have something that you need to hold on to, yada yada yada. But
so for the matrix search part, I think some of this got talked about in the channel and on the other, but I do want to address it because it's come up in rules and it's come up a couple other places. We do use raw, but what raw means is arguable. So the chart on core 241 talks about thresholds and dice pool modifiers. The GM has to know which of those apply. Is it really hidden? Is it secret? And they didn't do a good job of defining, is it in a host or not? Because, honestly, if it's protected or secret, it's not on the matrix at large, but it's totally in a host. So the matrix search table, to me, and current rules team as a result, is primarily for, and is based by the times, primarily for an open matrix search. I log in from my house or wherever, my comlink, and I'm going to ask the matrix a question. So if I'm looking for easy stuff, I can do simple search terms, and it'll take a little bit, and I'll find it. And the reason I'm setting the threshold is how much work am I putting into this? Am I using really cool search terms? Am I touching way more hosts to find it? Am I setting loose my search algorithms in the wild matrix, and it's going to take a half a day to come back? Those are decisions under my control, and I don't know where that knowledge is. So I have to say how hard I want it and what I'm trying for. And then I make the roll to see if I make that threshold. And the GM knows if that was even enough. So if it turns out that I think the courthouse plans are just not publicized, that the actual floor plans for a courthouse aren't publicized, I can go look on the open matrix for the courthouse plans at threshold 3. If it turns out that enemy action or corp or a secret project or something has actively looked for that and put it somewhere, the GM knows it's actually a threshold 6 test, but I don't. And the fact that my threshold 3 that I thought sure should work came back empty means I either screwed it up or it's been hidden. And then a knowledge check or something else could tell me which of those was the case, and I could make a new search at the higher threshold. A lot of players and a lot of GMs encourage this. You can do the fast and dirty searches to see what loose information's out there and then do drill downs. So I might do a tier 3 search to check me feed pages as well as, easily accessible, hey, this guy's been in the news for being a corporate exec or whatever, to see if there's any information on my target. And then based on that information, I'll do a tier 6 to see the dirt that's been actively hidden, like people going hunting down his Google pages to kill them because he had a Nazi lingerie party in Germany and they still hate that stuff. And then if all of that comes up empty, but on my tier 3 search I found out he was an Evo employee, Maybe I'll go hunt down an Evo host and look inside their host for the secret stuff that wasn't on the wider matrix. But it's all under the player control of player agency. The GM just has to know where these things are going to be and if there are any dice pool modifiers on it. The other question that you asked, Hidden, about, how are you going to know what the threshold should be? The easy answer is, if you talk to your GM, or the GM talks to the player, and what do I think it is? Based on their level of skill or your mood, you could be like, you think it's a 3, or you could have them do a knowledge chill check. Knowledge matrix theory for that sort of stuff could be in dozens of extremely public places. You'll probably only need a threshold 1. Or that's actually sensitive. It's probably a threshold 3 or higher. How hard do you want to try to find it? And let them choose, because player agency is a really important thing.
Okay. Are we?
Yeah,
That got through the questions I know about, and I think we're done. Do we have more?
Do we, Spio? You wrote them down.
That was no. The only one that I hadn't answered at least was the number 7 about the what can you do beforehand.
So I'm good to wrap this up.
Excellent.
I think.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank you all for coming out tonight. Was that free?
I have one more important thing. This has come up. It's been a problem. The trace icon action. It's a normal matrix action for tracing people.
Mm-hmm.
The sneak program does not protect you from trace icon. It protects you from convergence. If you trace a person, you get the marks, and you actually trace their physical location, you get their physical location.
Well,
as GMs, you can use that, and as players can use that too. The program, they don't get your physical protection when they converge on you, does not affect the trace icon program or action.
Yeah, you can still get converged on. They just don't automatically get to trace you when they converge on you.
Right. But if you actually go to the trouble of getting the marks, getting 2 marks, and doing trace icon, if you succeed in the trace, get past all the defenses and everything, and succeed on the trace, there is no program that's going to make that like, haha, you can't get me. It's come up before where people have thought that's true, but that's only true about God's convergence. If a demigod is haunting you and physically traces you, you're still boned.
Okay. Well then, I would like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I would like to thank our wonderful host for giving us their wealth of knowledge. We have worked really hard on this for the past 3 or 4 months, I think.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
There have been many win as goods.
Yeah. Thank you all for sitting through this 3.5-hour workshop.
Yes.
The VOD will be up at some point. We gotta edit and all that. We have handouts in the handout section, and any players who are here who didn't get my links beforehand, they can PM me for them. And that's it, folks.
Yep, and the VOD is using a different bit of audio, so I'm getting rid of all the Discord lag and the sounds of my mechanical keyboard and all of those things that slipped through during the stream.
Yeah.
So it'll be an even better instance of this workshop.
Yep.
Whenever it gets done, hopefully soon.
That's it for tonight, folks.
All right.
Great seeing you.
All right.
That's all, folks. Have fun.
Bye.
Thanks for attending.